Hey guys, welcome to the Sleep Haunt. Tonight, we drift out onto the open water, where the horizon stretches silver, and the sea keeps its patient rhythm beneath us. Ships move like quiet shadows, their cabins glowing softly, their corridors humming with a calm you can almost hear. These 10 accounts come from those still hours at sea moments, when the steady pulse of a voyage shifts and something older, something stranger, brushes close. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'd love to see how far this tide reaches. Now settle in, listen to the hush of the ocean, and let each story carry you like fog across the deck, gentle, suspenseful, and waiting for you at the edge of sleep. Story number 1. Near midnight, when most of the dining rooms had gone mute and the last cups of tea cooled on their saucers, a pale slice of light appeared on the horizon where no chart said it should be. The ship kept her course, dressed in a ribbon of white foam, steady as a heartbeat. The night air was soft and warm, a polished darkness that smelled faintly of salt, and something like rain that never arrived. The light blinked again. Slow, patient, like a lighthouse turning its face. A trio of friends returned from the piano bar and paused at the rail, elbows resting on cool metal. One pointed. The other squinted. A picture-perfect lighthouse beam swept far out across the water, though the ship was drifting along a route where only open ocean should lie for hundreds of miles. It was not the flicker of another vessel. This was deliberate, measured, a steady arc that traced the waves as if counting them. On deck 7, a night steward rolled fresh towels in a cart, easing it over the quiet carpet. Every so often, a soft tap came through the wall, the sort of sound old ships sometimes make when they settle and breathe. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was regular enough to notice. He paused in the corridor, one hand on the cart, and listened. The sound traveled like a strand, pulled tight, from the hull to the handrail, to the brass frame of a cabin number that trembled, as if it held a tiny heartbeat. Above, in the bridge where glass met darkness on all sides, the officers watched their instruments and the quiet sea. The radar was clean, the autopilot held steady. Yet through the windows, past reflections of neat uniforms and star charts clipped beneath lamps, the arc of that impossible beacon turned again, washing the ship's wake in a pale wash that looked like chalk drawn across the water. Those who were awake were not frightened at first. The ocean loves to play with light. Time can slip a little under the moon. But as the minutes unrolled, something about the light's patience pressed softly into the ship's routine. The coffee machine in the crew mess emptied itself 3 times in a row, and no one could say who had been there to drink it. In a quiet interior cabin, a traveler woke and gazed at the ceiling, certain someone had just whispered a name unclear and gentle as a sigh. In a suite with a balcony, a book left open to press a sprig of paper bookmark had turned 1 page more, a corner folded neatly by no hand in particular. The steward heard the tapping again. Tap, 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 pause, tap. He found it almost comforting, like a metronome. He lifted his pen and, on the underside of his palm where no guest would see, made small dots in the rhythm of the sound. Patterns emerged. A simple kind of code, the kind taught in old scouting manuals and in radio rooms no one visits anymore. A becomes one small tap, B a longer one, and so on. Not exact, but near enough to suggest meaning. He did not translate it completely. Still, an idea brushed his mind like a sleeve. Awake. Are you awake? Outside, the lighthouse beam passed across the rows of deck chairs stacked like sleeping birds. It licked the reflective glass of an empty boutique and sent a faint white oval sliding across scarves and ribboned hats. It traveled along the walkway and climbed the lifeboat's curved hulls, highlighting numbers in tidy stencils. The beam did not hurry. It made no errors in its sweep, as if it had always known the ship would be there at that hour, with those particular passengers leaning there, with that particular wind. A person with a camera set it to long exposure, hoping to capture the ghost of the moving light. The resulting image showed a gentle white band, smooth as the edge of a shell, draped close to the ship without a source. They showed it to others, and even those who preferred rational things leaned over the glowing screen, glanced up at the horizon, and then back down, eyes a little wider, lips closed in thought. It is rare to be surprised at sea. Everything operates by timetable and law. Strange to feel, then, that something had joined the ship briefly, asked a question by simply existing, and waited for an answer. On the bridge, The captain moved no dials, but the ship, mischievous in the way large things sometimes are, shifted her shoulder against the current with a dancer's subtlety, aligning her path so the beam stayed astern. Then a beam, then ahead, as if the two were conversing in an old language that used only direction and patience. The sea, enormous and even-tempered that night, offered no opposing opinion. It simply held them, as it always does, in a vast and complicated hand. In a cabin 3 decks down, an elderly passenger laid a hearing aid on the bedside table and discovered, without it, that she could hear the ship more clearly. At a certain angle, the hum became a voice, not with words but with feeling. The kind of feeling a road gives underfoot when a walker has known it for years. The kind of feeling a clock gives just before it strikes. She remembered a lighthouse visit as a child. The climb, the iron steps, the glass warm as breath in the sun, and how the keeper had opened the logbook for visitors to sign. She had written her name in careful letters, small and neat, and beneath it, a note. "Thank you for the light." She closed her eyes and, smiling slightly, placed her hand on the wall between bed and window. Through the paint and paneling, through insulation and steel, came a subtle thrumming and that delicate tapping, polite as a knock at a distant door. Tap, 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 pause, tap. It seemed, to those attuned to small things, that the ship had slipped into a circle, not enough to ring alarms, only enough to make the stars repeat themselves. The Big Dipper dipped twice. A meteor that should have been unique arrived again, in the same part of the sky, with the same brief brush of silver. The carpet in a hallway showed a design of stylized waves. Walking down it, one had the brief sensation that the pattern was moving forward too, so that feet traveled farther without arriving anywhere. The elevator doors opened on a deck that looked, at first glance, identical to the last. Only the flower arrangement by the casino's entrance was subtly different, as though refreshed twice in a single night. It would have been easy to call it a trick of fatigue. Yet the lighthouse beam disagreed. It felt like a hand held out to a child in a crowd. Patient, unwavering, waiting to be taken. The steward with the tapping had stopped the cart now, hidden behind a pillar where he could stand and be a pair of ears with no responsibility except to bear witness. He listened for meaning again. Awake, awake and move. Awake and look. The beam slid across the water and held steady as the ship adjusted her angle. Not enough to wake the sleepers, just enough to change the way the bow cut the dark. Something in the water caught the reflection a little closer now, like the oval of light had glanced off a face in the deep. A breeze came, light as a sigh, and lifted small hairs on arms and the edges of napkins left on balcony tables. There was the hint no more of a distant bell. In old times, bells belonged to buoys and lantern, towers. They marked shoals and warned of fog. But this night was clear, and the charts showed no nearby structures. The officers on the bridge, careful and trained, looked again at their instruments, ran checks that needed no running, and at last exchanged a look that said, "We see it too. Not alarm, not fear, only respect," the sort given to things that existed long before anyone wrote manuals. A child, restless, slipped from her bunk and padded to the balcony where her parent had dozed in a chair. She tugged the blanket, seeking a place on the lap, and the parent, half awake, lifted an arm without opening eyes. The child cocked her head at the smooth horizon and whispered, though no one had taught her to hush the ocean. "It's calling," she said, and nestled into the warmth. The ship followed the light. The sensation of circling eased. The stars stopped repeating themselves. The carpet's waves settled. Somewhere, a housekeeping supervisor checking doorknobs reached the end of a corridor, and to her small surprise, discovered that it was in fact the end, not an elegant loop leading back to where she'd begun. In the morning, nothing official would note the event. Logs would remain ordinary. The captain would host a cheerful announcement about a beautiful day at sea and how, with a light breeze and modest swell, breakfast out on deck would be especially nice. The lighthouse would not appear on any report, because it had not, strictly speaking, existed where anyone could write it down. But those awake in that hour kept their own logs, written on the inside of their lives. Later, many days later, or maybe even the following afternoon, when the sun gilded the white paint and made the deck metal hot to the touch, someone would look over a collection of dusty black and white photos hung in a hallway, honoring maritime history. One picture would show a lighthouse that had once stood on a cliff that no longer exists. Its slopes slid into the sea long ago. The caption would note the year it went dark, the keeper's name, the path up from the village. The person would tilt their head, look at the angle of the beam in the photograph, and feel the friendly ache of recognition. That night, in the wake where foam sewed a loose seam, the water kept its sound like paper torn very slowly. Passengers slept. The steward finished his rounds, then paused one last time in the corridor where the tapping had traveled. He pressed his palm to the wall in a quiet thank you to no one anyone could see. No reply came, because one was not necessary. The ship itself was the reply, arrowing forward with a soft confidence, the way one walks after finding a lost path again. And if anyone stood at the stern to watch the wake narrow into darkness, they might have noticed the foam framing a shape not unlike a lamp's faint circle. They might have blinked and blamed it on moonlight. Yet ships remember, and seas remember, and sometimes a memory remembers back. After the third sunrise of the voyage, the elderly passenger with the hearing aid stopped by the hallway of photographs again and placed her finger lightly near the name of the keeper in the caption. For a moment, she felt the iron stairs under her hand once more, the circle of glass around her, the turning world below. "Thank you for the light," she had written long ago. In a book in a place that stood no longer, the words had traveled across pages that no longer exist, across wood long repurposed, paint long flaked, and returned to dust. Even so, they had been heard. On any given night, a ship at sea wears a crown of quiet lights that look small against the open dark. Some are navigation, some are comfort, some are ceremony, standing watch over dinner, and dancing and midnight walks. And perhaps, very occasionally, one belongs not to the ship at all but to something that keeps an eye on travelers, strolling alongside for a little while just to make sure a circle becomes a line again. The sea is large, and people do not own it. They borrow passage and they tell stories, and they lean together against rails that have seen so many nights they might as well be calendars. When the light returned to the horizon on the next voyage, if it did, it may have been seen by different eyes, an insomniac chef taking air between shifts, a pair of newlyweds carrying chairs closer to feel the movement, a retired mariner who would not mention it but would stand a little straighter from the respect of it. The beam would sweep, the ship would nod, and another small exchange would pass between the living ocean and those who cross it. The details would change. The meaning would remain the same. Awake, awake, and move. Awake, and look. The message required no translation and no name. It was the sound of a voyage remembering what it is for, to carry hearts and hopes and simple luggage across deep water and deliver them safely to the bright side of morning. The lighthouse that was not there said nothing more. It turned its patient face one last time, and the ship slipped onward, unafraid. Story number 2. Long after the last show released its audience and the buffet trays were tucked beneath silver lids, the elevators settled into a slower rhythm. Their chimes sounded like soft bells half remembered from a dream, a friendly punctuation to the hush that followed midnight at sea. They went about their work with quiet dignity, opening and closing, carrying night shift crew and the few passengers who liked to wander when most had fallen asleep. On the panel, the row of numbers glowed like a tiny city. There was no 13 in that city. Between 12 and 14 lay a courteous skip, a blank place polite enough to be almost invisible. Sometimes, between the hours when the ship's bars sighed themselves empty and the sun suggested its return from far below the horizon, one elevator chimed in a slightly different way. The sound landed a shade lower. The tone had a warmth to it, as if the bell had been struck by a gloved hand. A handful of people noticed over the course of one voyage, each in an ordinary moment that slipped sideways into something that felt like a faint ripple where the smooth surface of routine had always been reliable. He noticed it first because he liked to walk after midnight. He drifted through quiet carpets, past sleeping boutiques, and the tender shine of a closed piano bar. He moved the way ships move, when there is nothing pressing to reach, when the sea is kind and the route is sure. He reached for the elevator not from impatience but from curiosity, to see the decks in their night version, the lights turned down, the mirrors holding softened reflections that seemed kinder to the figure inside them. The button's ring lit under his finger, amber rather than white. The doors opened with a whisper he felt in his shoes. Inside, the panel's numbers glowed their usual friendly line. 14 was the highest. He pressed 12. The closed door button pulsed once, and the car rose smoothly. At 9, where there was always a tiny ping, there came instead a three-note chime in which the middle tone lingered, inviting as a hand extended to show a step. He did not step back when the display blinked. The 12 paused, then dimmed. A dash appeared. Then a letter. R. The car stopped. With a kindness that suggested it had known, he would be there to feel it. The doors parted. Beyond lay a corridor neither he nor the map in his back pocket had ever seen. It was not the corridor of a ghost story, not cold, not rotten, not torn. It looked, in the first glance, like any good ship. A long ribbon of carpet with a pattern of thin waves, the kind that always makes one think of breeze and rope and daylight. The lights were tucked into the ceiling in a way that left no shadows to be suspicious of. There was a faint scent of lemon, the smell of cloth carefully rolled from a dispensing cart, of wood polished in comfort rather than haste. He stepped out and felt the ship's very small movements through his feet. A door on his left wore a plaque that said, "Observation Lounge, closed for refit," in a font a little more old-fashioned than the signs on his usual decks. He listened. Someone counted softly, 3 beats repeated with the patience of a metronome too shy to be heard above a whisper. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. If a dancer had practiced here once, the room seemed to be greeting their memory with the courteous attention of an empty theater on a weekday afternoon. He did not try the handle. He walked instead, measuring his pace, glancing at the framed photographs set along the wall. The ship he was sailing on appeared in them, but in small differences, a slightly different curve of the funnel, a lifeboat shape with a more rounded hatch. The carpet underfoot had no stains. The stainless rails wore no fingerprints. A sign pointed to promenade, though the ship he knew did not have a promenade quite there. Another sign, tucked at an angle as if a steward had straightened it at closing time, said rehearsal access. He turned once, twice, and found himself precisely where he had expected to be. At the mouth of the elevator again, the doors beyond already half closed, as if the car had taken a breath and was about to answer a call elsewhere. He stepped inside. The dash became a 10, then an 11, and it carried him where he had asked to go without complaint. On 12, the doors opened to the carpet he knew, the scent of night coffee turning lukewarm near the deserted pool deck, the quiet glow of the ship's map on a screen. He glanced at it. The gentle dot that said, "You are here," did not blink from anywhere unusual. The row of lights beside the elevator showed no gaps beyond the accepted skip between 12 and 14. He did not mention it to anyone. He slept, dreamless, and woke to morning with breakfast, sunshine, laughter. Later that day, a woman who had spent the afternoon in the art gallery lingered by the lift after the last bidder had collected a print rolled in a tube. She held nothing in her hands, and yet felt as if she were carrying a small armful of music. The gallery's attendant had left a sign that said, "Closed, back at 9. The ship hummed softly around her. When the elevator doors opened, there stood the amber glow. She rode alone, trying her best not to think of old stories about missing decks. When the panel offered her the letter rather than the number, she felt the same velvety quiet in her chest as before a painting is unveiled. The corridor that received her seemed to hold its breath kindly. On a table near the wall sat a row of water glasses half full, not dusty but beaded with the faintest condensation, as if someone had poured them in readiness for a group that had paused before coming to drink. The folded napkins were crisp triangles. A sheet of paper lay under a polished paperweight the shape of the ship's funnel. She did not lift it. She did not need to. The paper's top edge read "Call Times." Below, the name of a show she had seen the night before, glided across the page in a script that matched the program in her purse. The page was blank beneath it, but not empty. It was the sort of blankness a stage wears before lights come up and voices begin. She smoothed one of the napkins with a fingertip. A pressing, no more, a domestic reflex that always found the corner that wanted to curl. The air made a small adjustment that felt like a polite nod. When she returned to the car, the 3-note chime sang to the doors as if praising their timing. Back on her usual deck, she glanced at her reflection. Something about it seemed lighter, a little better rested than it had any right to be. She kept the moment, folded like a napkin inside her day. On the bridge, where calm eyes watched instruments and horizon, no one saw any unfamiliar letters on any screen. The cameras showed reasonable pictures. A night security officer, thorough with his monitors, Did notice one square that ticked past an elevator opening onto a hall where a small gleam moved along the floor like a reflection of stars on water. He leaned closer and realized he was seeing the way light scattered from a passing tray's polished lid somewhere else entirely. The feed blinked. It returned to a list of menus in the crew mess. Cycling through stew, salad, soup, 3 choices of bread. Night deepened again. The ship crossed a patch of sea that behaved like silk smoothed by a slow hand. The walkways felt shorter. The stairs felt kinder on knees. He went back to the elevator with the amber ring because curiosity can be a gentle thing that asks politely to be allowed to know a little more. He pressed the button. He heard the warmth in the chime. He entered, pressed no number at all, and touched the closed door button once, then once again. Without a shiver, as if following instructions given at the dawn of its own service, the car moved. The display paused at a dash. The letter arrived like a promise kept with grace. The corridor beyond received him as one receives a guest who has been here before, but brings no loud needs. The door marked Observation Lounge, closed for refit, had no lock sitting proud of its latch. The metal smiled like a polished spoon. He turned the handle gently and pushed. It gave with the meekness of doors that are used to opening onto quiet spaces. Inside lay a room both ready and restful. Low lighting, chairs arranged as if conversation had just paused, a small stage with a curtain closed, its deep fabric catching light in ripples. On a table sat a cloth-covered tray, empty but for a single matchbook tucked on the corner, its cover holding the ship's name in an older font rounder, more elegant than the type on the cabin keycards. He lifted it, not as if to take it, but to feel its weight. It weighed almost nothing. He could imagine the way a fingertip once flipped it open to show a line of tiny wooden stems, each head perfect, unstruck. He set it back precisely where it had lain. In the glass, his reflection waited without impatience. For a breath, he thought it delayed. But then it matched his movement exactly. An illusion born of soft light and the slow sway of the ship. Somewhere within the venting, a whispered 1, 2, 3 returned. The room was not lonely. It did not want company, either. It was the kind of place a ship keeps for the moments it must rehearse its own manners. He closed the door and stood in the hall. The carpet's pattern shifted if one looked too long, the woven waves seeming to settle themselves, not to deceive but to soothe. He walked to the end, turned the corner, and found himself near a viewport. The glass was oval, framed in steel. Through it, the ocean purred. He lifted a hand. The outside night accepted the gesture, without echo. When he lowered it, a faint dry line appeared on the glass where his palm had collected a fine dew, and then left it missing for a moment. It faded at once, absorbed by the steady breath of the sea. Back in the lift, the car took him up without making him feel as if he had left anything unkindly. The door opened onto the regular midnight again. In a stairwell, a small noise like applause drifted from below. It was only the normal work of air moving through a grate, but it wore the same timbre as polite hands in a theater, the sort that say thank you at the end of a performance that ended exactly when it should. On another deck that night, a retired music teacher woke and sat up, heart entirely calm. She had heard the 3-note chime inside a dream and found, upon waking, that the sound continued in the hallway outside her cabin. She walked to the door and half opened it, the way one does in a hotel just to be sure no one is lost in the corridor. The elevator doors across the way parted to reveal a car so softly lit it seemed to carry the idea of sunrise in miniature. No one stood within. The chime repeated itself, and she recognized, with the embarrassed fondness a professional feels when a favorite instrument is slightly out of tune, that the middle note had wandered. She hummed the correct pitch under her breath, a little offering to the quiet. On the next chime, the elevator found her note. The doors closed as if satisfied. She smiled and went back to bed, as if she had tucked the ship in for the night. By day, there was no mention of Deck R on any handout or announcement. By day, the doors wore their ordinary tone. The children splashed, and the old men played shuffleboard, and the sea threw handfuls of light into the pool as if it were a bowl it liked to decorate. The ship went where it was meant to go. But night returned, as it always does, ready to set small things to rights that daylight had rightly overlooked. On the 5th night, a quiet notice slid into the crew schedule. A drill rescheduled for the following week. Tonight, no muster. Still at 12 past midnight, A handful of interior cabins felt a faint tick in their walls, a count too modest to alarm anyone. A steward passing a service door paused. The handle had turned itself a hair, as if the door had breathed. He checked it and moved on. The runner felt a brush of air on his wrist as he reached the elevator again, and the amber ring glowed from within, as if it knew him now. The letter greeted him. He stepped onto the corridor with the sense of someone arriving early and finding the room grateful for that kindness. Along the carpet's edge, a sequence of darker shapes led away footsteps. He thought first, but no. Not prints of weight, but patches where the air had dried the nap slightly. A trail of absence rather than mark, like the tracks left briefly when a towel comes off a warm railing. They led to a section where a line was painted with precision across the carpet, a mock-up stripe, its color bright white, its text reading, "Assemble here." No voices arrived to fill the space. And yet the place felt attended. The ship seemed to be checking names no one else needed to hear. He stood very still. The 123 paused. In its place came the smallest sound of polite conversation, the way an empty hall sometimes remembers. Syllables without words, warmth without meaning. It lasted no longer than a breath. Then the three-note chime drifted in from somewhere he could not see, and he realized that the elevator doors were open behind him, and that the car would wait exactly as long as he required. No more, no less. He walked back and placed one hand on the car's rail. It was cool and honest under his palm. He thought of the matchbook and the unused matches, the paper with its call times, the glasses of water ready to be drunk and happy to stand and bide their due if no one came. He thought of the number 13 left off the panel, and how absence can be a sort of courtesy too. He thought about rehearsal, how even the most seasoned performer steps through the motions one last time before an audience arrives. Not for fear, not from doubt, but from respect. The car lifted him. The hall outside his cabin looked precisely as it always did. A steward's cart had been parked with its polite tilt toward the wall. A small framed safety card shone behind glass. Somewhere, far away, he thought he heard applause, and then realized it was only the sea passing along the hull, the way a hand passes across a tablecloth to smooth it for guests. Morning brought a slip of paper beneath doors, a daily schedule with a pattern of boxes and times. Someone in the print queue had left a faint ghosted 13 in the column of decks on the back page. The number stood there for a few press runs, translucent as if it belonged and did not, a watermark from a template no longer used. By mid-morning, the staff had replaced the stack with a corrected version. He kept the first one in his book and did not mention why. On the last night before land, the elevators rang with their customary cheer. The chimes were true, the steps precise. Yet for those who had heard the other tone, who had seen the corridor that was not on any map, there came a moment between two floors when the car eased itself with a care that felt almost affectionate, and the panel held a dash that lingered long enough to be noticed. In that breath, they felt the ship's practiced patience, its way of making sure everything was ready, not only the trays and the shows and the ropes, but the quieter things as well. The glass would not spill, the doors would not catch a sleeve. The path to the open air would be exactly where it should be. Those things mattered. The ship remembered that they mattered. When dawn combed out the dark and the harbor came forward with its cranes like careful fingers, the elevators were bright and ordinary once more. The letter did not appear again. The number remained politely missing. People rolled suitcases, took one last photograph of the carpet's waves, and stepped ashore. The ship exhaled and inhaled, letting the day wrap itself correctly around all the things it must do. Deep inside, perhaps, a quiet room stood in readiness and counted to 3, and counted to 3 again, not because it feared anything or required praise, but in the way that a heart counts, steady and watchful, while a body sleeps and wakes and goes about its errands. Some nights at sea hold a pocket of time that feels like velvet. The mind drifts there and finds an in-between place, real but shy, welcoming but not eager, precise as a bell struck gently by a gloved hand. The elevator chime that wandered and then found its note again was not a warning. It was an invitation to consider what goes on when no one is watching. The rituals that keep a ship from ever feeling careless. A forgotten letter in a panel, a hallway with a pattern that soothes the eye, a door that opens and closes without fuss. He carried the notion off the gangway like something folded small in a pocket, the kind of thing one keeps, and when someone mentions the superstition of missing floors, smiles a little and says nothing, because he knew now that the missing is not the same as the gone. Sometimes the missing is a place kept aside, where a ship practices being the reason people fall asleep to the sound of water and wake to a morning that holds, quite simply, everything upright and in place. Story number 3. Every evening after dinner, when the corridors began to smell faintly of citrus and clean linen, small cards appeared on pillows with the soft certainty of habits practiced 1,000 times. A square of cream paper, a neat bit of print, a folded corner sometimes tucked under a chocolate. Most nights, those cards carried lines about stars or sea breezes, phrases designed to be light and forgettable. On this voyage, they were different. Not dramatik, not even peculiar at first glance. Just attentive. She noticed because she always read everything: menus, safety cards, the fine print on the back of the daily schedule that most people skimmed. Traveling alone gave her the sort of free attention that drifted into details. The first night, her card did not offer a quote. It said, in a graceful serif, "If you hear a card outside, give it 10 seconds. Then open your door." She smiled at the oddity and slipped the card under her phone, a small paper roof. Around midnight, a rattling hum passed her cabin wheels on carpet. A tray's soft clink. She reached for the handle, and then remembered. 10 seconds. She counted in a whisper, opening on 10 to find a room service cart close enough that a quick step would have bruised a shin if she had not waited. She laughed at the neatness of it, a coincidence that felt like a magic trick, performed very kindly for a crowd of one. The next night, the card read, "Draw the balcony curtain before you sleep." The weather didn't demand it. The sea lay smooth, but she tugged the fabric closed anyway, enjoying the soft shush it made as it crossed the rail. At 3 in the morning, a breeze shouldered the ship with a playful firmness. The curtain stirred but did not thrash. A pair of deck chairs outside slid a delicate inch and then stopped, their movement catching in the fabric's stillness and not quite reaching the glass. The sound was small, a kitten's footfall compared to the theater of storms, yet her heart thanked the card for its modest foresight as if it had held a lamp on a footpath. Other cabins received cards with sentences that felt like friendly advice rather than instruction. In one, a family found a note that said, "Be careful of fingers when you close the bathroom door. It swings quick." The child, a talkative comet of a person in the daylight, nodded gravely and kept small hands well away. In another cabin, a pair of friends discovered, "Leave your shoes by the chair tonight, not by the door." In the morning, a suitcase rolling from the hall caught only carpet and not a lace to snag and tumble. The cards were not eerie. They were gentle interference, a subtle mending of seams no one had seen fraying. She started keeping the cards between the pages of her book. Not from superstition, exactly. The paper felt nice under her fingers, heavy enough to suggest the ship chose it with care. On the third evening, her card had a faint watermark she had not noticed before. The outline of a compass rose, almost invisible unless the light hit just right. The words said, "If you wake a little after 2, listen for a bell. It's not for you. Turn your pillow and sleep again." She did wake, eyes surfacing through the dark with that sense of being called by something precise. A bell sounded far away, not loud, not urgent. She could not tell whether it was inside the ship or out across the water, as if a buoy had leaned into its own rhythm. She turned her pillow and placed her ear where the cotton still felt cool. Sleep returned as if it had been waiting just there. In the morning, she stared at the card and thought, kindness is a kind of haunting too, only with warm hands. The housekeeping staff who tucked the cards into place kept their usual pace and grace. When she thanked the steward assigned to her section, he looked delighted and apologetic in the same breath. "We don't write them," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a workplace secret that deserved respect. "We just place them. They come down with the linen from printing. Sometimes they mix with the poems. I don't know who decides." In the laundry, machines turned with their patient thunder. Sheets rolled like clouds, towels stacked with a satisfying weight. Somewhere among all that steady work, a slim tuck of paper slid along as if in a slow river, and then surfaced at the right time to be dried, folded, and sent upstairs. The ship did many things nobody noticed. This was just another one. The fourth card read, "Don't hurry if the lift arrives with someone inside looking down. Let the next one take you." She carried it in her pocket like a worry stone. On deck 6, She stepped toward the elevator and saw a man holding a tray of desserts stare at his shoes as if the carpet were a map with his name on it. The car was nearly full, a soft jostle of conversation. She stepped back. The next lift arrived empty, a cool square of quiet, and she rode up in the company of her own reflection. It should not have mattered. But it did. The idea of not pressing into the small space, of letting her day breathe for a few extra seconds, felt like a gift she had not known to ask for. That night, the card under her turned-down duvet smelled faintly different. Not lemon, not the usual clean linen note. Something else. Paper dust, she thought. Old books. The words leaned towards specificity. At 10, 17, look toward the atrium. You will hear a sound like glass sighing. Do not stand under the chandelier now. The atrium. She read it twice and felt an uncomplicated decision settle. She had no reason to be at the atrium at that exact minute. Yet the ship's schedule put a trivia game there, and the path from dinner to bed often crossed the grand space where light fell like music. By habit, she wandered with a cup of tea around 10. At 16 past, she paused at a railing. At 17, a small tremor moved through the ceiling glass, a temperature shift making a pane find its comfort within a frame. The chandelier below, a cascade of cut shapes like droplets frozen mid-fall, gave a sound that justified the card's choice of the word sigh. A single crystal loosened, swung gently on its wire, and then settled as if a hand had steadied it. Nothing fell. Nothing broke. The space remained a marvel. Yet a breath passed through the onlookers the way air moves through a field when wind passes over grass. A ripple of attention. Then calm. She looked down at the card in her coat pocket, lips pressed together in a small smile that shared space with a shiver. Her neighbor down the hall, a retired cartographer with a delightful tendency to talk about maps as if they had opinions, knocked on her door as she was pinning her hair. "Have you been getting peculiar messages?" he asked, not stepping past the threshold, holding his own card with 2 fingers as though it might blur if warmed by his palm. His card read, "The door across from you stays open longer than it needs to. Don't be the one to close it." He had watched that evening as a couple propped a room with a suitcase, then remembered something and disappeared inside. A well-meaning passerby moved to push it shut. He had put out his hand and said with a gentle firmness, "Leave that one. They'll realize." They had, laughing, retrieving the case that would have wedged the latch. They began to compare notes, not daily but when fate parked them at the same stretch of rail at sunset. Some cards were practical. Some felt like reminders from a considerate grandparent who'd learned the ship's temperament better than anyone else. A crew member balancing a stack of napkins might find a card saying, 2 steps, then stop. The stacked edges will slip, otherwise. A teenager discovered. The outdoor chessboard pawns roll if you set them by the bench. Keep them on the squares. A violinist with the ship's quartet pulled a card from her music folder. For the encore, choose the piece with the long bow. The room wants holding, not fireworks. She had smiled, taken a breath, and at the end, felt the audience exhale in relief, as if someone had tied a ribbon on the evening in exactly the right place. By the 6th night, the compass watermark on the card stood more visible, as if humidity had brought it forward. If she set the cards side by side on her desk, the compass points aligned, the faint lines reaching from one square of paper into another. Not a map, precisely. The print shop's art, maybe. Still, she traced the lines with a fingertip and felt a tug of curiosity. Printing plates have their logic. Paper travels in stacks. Some repeating pattern belonged here, something like tide times and watch shifts, precise and human at once. Her 7th card did not sit on her pillow. It had found its way under her door mid-afternoon, in a slide as soft as a whisper. It read, "When you pass forward on 12 tonight, take the starboard hallway, pause by the portrait of the ship in winter seas. There is a reflection you will want to see." The time on the card was 9:52. She arrived early, unwilling to make the moment a sprint. The hallway was bright, the carpet a repeating motif of shells and ropes. The portrait showed the ship riding a pale green swell, her bow neat as a well-dressed collar. She watched her own face appear in the glass, silvered slightly by ceiling lights. People passed, some stopping, some not. At 52, A child leaned toward the painting and stuck her tongue out. Her reflection did the same. The child laughed. Then the lights above moved 1 degree in what must have been a timer, adjusting the hall for late evening. In that slimmer glow, for the briefest moment, the glass offered a different view. Not her face, not the child's, but the same corridor. Subtly changed flowers at the corner table that were not there now. A different safety placard frame. An older logo at the bottom of the printed map on the wall. She saw herself reflected in that other corridor too, a little out of step, watching herself watch. The light dimmed a shade further. The glass returned to normal, obedient and blank as reflective surfaces mostly are. She had not been frightened. The feeling resembled the sensation of catching an old friend's eye across a busy street and exchanging a nod that meant, without any need for words, "I see you. You're well. Good." On a whim, she visited guest services. The desk staff, polite in their always pleasant way, listened to her describe the cards, smiling with the genuine interest that comes when the world behaves in charming ways. "We do print some of them," one admitted. A set of rest easy messages, but we didn't approve the chandelier one. He glanced at his colleague. "We heard the sound, though." The head of housekeeping, passing by with a tablet and the graceful authority of someone who holds many small puzzles in mind at once, paused and joined the conversation. "We have a stock of cards with the compass watermark," she said. "Left from a sister ship we acquired years ago. Sometimes they come mixed with the new batch. The old ones have a way of showing up at the right time." She said it without superstition, in the calm register of someone who has stopped insisting that every helpful thing must fit an instruction manual. "We respect it," she added simply. "It seems to keep the ship considerate." As the voyage lengthened, a communal game began without anyone stating the rules. If a card told someone to pause by the staircase at a certain time, they did, and found themselves standing conveniently aside while a service team whisked by with a plant so large it felt like a moving tree. If a card suggested wearing a hat on a deck that had been windless all day, the evening offered a mischievous gust and a confetti of napkins. Guests began to tuck the cards into the corners of mirrors, pin them with magnets to cabin walls, pass them along like talismans with the soft joy of being in on a secret that helped rather than harmed. One afternoon a card slid under her door with a different weight. The paper felt older, as if stored a long time. The type was the same graceful serif, but a tiny ship's emblem at the top looked more rounded, the funnel painted with a thinner stripe. The message read, "There is a bookshelf forward where few people stand. Look at the third shelf, left side. The spine you want is the pale blue. Inside is the earliest card." She went because how could she not? The forward lounge held a reading nook, arms of chairs like welcoming commas, a low case with travel guides and novels. On the third shelf, left side, a pale blue book leaned modestly between atlases. She slid it free. Inside the cover, slipped like a bookmark, lay a card gone honey color with time. The compass watermark almost shimmered, as if light loved it. The words were handwritten, a gentle script. "For those who sail and those who sleep, a reminder. The sea is big, and kindness is ballast." Turndown began as a promise. "Let it be one still." Someone had written a date beneath. Years ago. She turned the card over. In tiny print, she found a name she recognized from the plaque near the crew offices. The founder of the ship's hospitality program, the person who had chosen the linen, the lounge chairs, the bowl of apples by the spa, who had introduced the idea that a ship could tuck people in as carefully as any grandmother. She felt a blush of gratitude for the unseen architecture of care in which she'd been living. That night, the card on her pillow said, "At dawn, if you wake, look at the wake. Count from the rail to the horizon and back. The numbers will fold your mind like a napkin. No secrets there, just a pleasant order." She woke with the sky pearl-colored and stepped onto her balcony. The wake trailed behind like a ribbon loosely braided. She counted, thinking of nothing, feeling the ship move with that paradox of vast mass and simple grace that always astonished her. The numbers warmed her, like counting breaths. She felt almost absurdly safe. Near voyage's end, the cards grew fewer as if a spring were winding down. The last one she received sat squarely on her pillow, plain, unwatermarked, contemporary. It said, "You have been listening well. Thank you. Leave this one for the next person." She did, tucking away the rest as keepsakes. The neighbor down the hall slipped his last into the crack behind his cabin's mirror. An old habit from his days at sea on charts, and ships the notion that a good thing left behind becomes part of the vessel's memory. Disembarkation morning was its bright bustle of bags and scanning barcodes, and a last look from the rail at the water that had carried them so politely. She passed through the atrium, glanced up, and felt a fondness for the chandelier as if it were a friend. The staff smiled their practiced, genuine smiles. The sea made its low paperwork sounds against the pier. The ship's public address voice wished everyone a safe journey ashore. For weeks afterward, opening a book on land, she would find a card between pages and feel a thread pull lightly, connecting couch to cabin, night to night, small courtesy to small courtesy, until the line ran clear from breakfast at home back out to the horizon. She would read one. Take the second stair. The first is busy, and step back from a curb, and let a stroller pass before her. She would smile at the notion that something as simple as a card could be a lantern in miniature. On some other voyage, perhaps, someone else would find a card that read, "If you do not need the last slice of cake, leave it. Someone coming behind you has had a long day." Or, "The wind at noon will flip menus. Keep a hand on yours and someone else's too." The ship would continue its quiet work of arranging and rearranging the hours so that luck looked like thoughtfulness, and thoughtfulness felt like luck. And if, late in some future night, a steward paused by a printer and watched a single cream square emerge without command, carrying a message meant for a cabin whose occupant needed a nudge, they might smile and slip it into the stack without comment. Their cart would roll down a silent hall that had known laughter and sleep, and the hush after both. A card would find a pillow. Someone would turn it over in their hands and sense, without any useful explanation, that the ship had noticed them kindly. Story number 4. After midnight, the lifeboat deck grew quiet in a way unlike the rest of the ship. The pools still murmured to themselves. The theater stored a faint scent of powder and perfume, and the casino machines blinked with the sleepy patience of lights left on for company. But the lifeboats hung in their cradles like paused thoughts. They were orderly, each within its davits, each rope coiled with the neatness of a promise. The air along that walkway tasted a little more of resin and technical things, paint that dries very slowly, oiled hinges, canvas with a memory of salt. She walked there to think. It was a habit she had not intended to make. Start on deck 7, go forward, turn at the mural of the old routes, count the life buoy stations, count the little green running man signs that always looked mid-stride even when nobody moved. Counting settled her mind. Numbers offered the friendly edges of fences, a way to gather thoughts like sheep and lead them back to the gate. On the first night she noticed the absence. Not a hole, exactly. Not a missing boat, just a gap that seemed more interested in being noticed than gaps usually are. Boat 10. Boat 11. Boat 12. A space her eyes slid over, as if the night had varnished it. Then boat 14. No ship labels a lifeboat with 13. Around the bait and world, that half superstition, half courtesy has been hammered into plaques and painted under rails. She knew this, and had never minded it. 13 sat fine in her calendar and her addresses. She liked the oddness of it. On ships, she accepted the skip as part of the design, like the way stars are arranged into pictures because someone long ago said they were. Yet this night, between 12 and 14, the davit seemed to hold a shape that both existed and politely looked away. She did not step closer. She simply noticed, the way one notices a window catching a different piece of sky. The sea was gentle. That helped. Waves sounded like paper torn very slowly. The ship's mouth of wake hissed its long sentence behind them, and the constellations thought private thoughts far above. She watched the gap. Nothing moved in it. A pendant of dew hung off a rope end, and grew fat, and then let go, falling into whatever lay between the painted curves. She imagined she heard it land. She told herself that was silly. The steel below did not catch such small notes. When she returned the next night, she stopped there again. The davits leaned in toward one another the way lampposts lean toward a corner, where people often meet. A small brass plate by the rail said Station C, the letters crisp and unbothered. Boat 12 sat properly. Boat 14 wore its numbers in the sturdy font she had seen in so many ports. Between them, the shadows held their breath. She looked for the dew pendants. She found none. Instead, a loop of rope lay with the easy elegance of fabric, familiar and strange, like the way a friendly cat occupies a circle on a carpet. She pressed her fingers to the railing and drew them along, feeling bumps and paint. The metal beneath was honest and cold. Further along, people laughed, quiet and light, the hour doing its usual work of making voices aware of other sleepers. She listened to the slam of a door somewhere inside, followed immediately by a second door closing a little more carefully, as if the first had taught the second a lesson. Small sounds, learned manners. The ship knew how to teach without scolding. On the third night, fog came. Not a wall, not a bad story's trick. Just a cloth lifted over the world, so the edges ran softer. The deck lights threw halos around themselves. The lifeboats wore their shapes like ideas. She stood at the gap and heard something that might have been a list. Not names. A list of roles, words like steward, bar, portside, assistant, porter, the syllables precise and almost too quiet to have traveled across the air. She had heard such lists before at drills, through radios, a language of making sure. This one sounded like the voice of a person who has practiced reading a list over and over until the list itself is less important than the act of saying it well. She thought of going to tell someone. Then she thought of what exactly she would say. That the space where a boat did not exist had spoken like a clipboard? It was not a useful sentence. She stayed. A breeze blew the fog, and the haloed lights shifted their crowns. The list stopped without finishing. She got the sudden impression, ridiculous and plain, of someone lifting a finger to hush an interruption. The silence afterward did not feel empty. It felt as if it had been put there deliberately, a pause to let everything take, to let a knot set and not loosen later. Day life aboard wrapped over the night like a new blanket. Children ran past the mural, picking favorite islands with fingers on the glass. Crew rolled carts with the confidence of hundreds of practiced corners. The sun printed a small rectangle of warmth on the bench by the nautically themed clock display. She did not go to the gap in daylight. The deck looked shorter then, more contained. Night made it long, a ribbon that could reach around thoughts and keep them from fraying. Something else began to bother her, not a chill, a detail. The muster map by the stairwell carried a clean design, all lines and arrows and green blocks that made sense even in a hurry. In Station C's panel, a small arrow pointed the wrong way. The green running man looked as if he'd chosen to sprint into a shuttered door. The error was modest, the sort anyone can miss until someone points. She looked twice, 3 times, not believing. She had walked that route in the drill. Her feet knew the truth. The map had one portion flipped, a mirror where none belonged. She walked to guest services with her idea folded small, not wanting to embarrass anyone, not wanting to be someone who corrects for pleasure. The person at the desk listened, then turned the map around, then called someone softly. The correction was made in less time than it took a mountain to change its mind about weather. She smiled, thanked them, and felt suddenly and deeply tired in the way one does after finding and fixing a stitch that has been loose a long time. When she went back to the lifeboat deck that evening, the gap between 12 and 14 felt less hungry. She almost laughed at herself for assigning appetite to shadows. It was windier that night. The canopy edges along the boats fluttered like fishtails. Lines pinged gently in their metal keepers. Somewhere far down the hull, a wave slapped with a sound that reminded her of a hand clapping against a thigh. She could smell a dry sweetness, something like rope warmed in sun remembered in the dark. She leaned on the rail. The list voice returned. Not voiced, not truly audible, but present. A cadence, a metered care. Catering, starboard, medical, photographers, children's club. Stops, starts, as if checking again. A man she recognized by sight from around the ship, one of those faces that appears at breakfast and then again on a stair, not remarkable except for its reliability, paused near her and squinted into the gap. "There's a boat we don't see," he said in a half-asking tone. British vowels smoothed by years. She turned to deny it and realized she believed him. "Or a place for one," she offered. "Something that's there as a promise." He nodded, satisfied with that phrasing in a way that suggested he, too, liked sentences that fit. They talked softly for a few minutes about other ships, other decks, the way some engines wear their vowels differently in their hum. He told her he once knew a purser who could tell a vessel's make by the sound it made around spoons and drawers. Everything has a voice, he said, and the lifeboat lines gave a small twitch that made them both laugh, quietly, as if the ship had agreed. He walked on. She stood long enough to feel the shake in her legs that warns of too much standing. She moved to leave, and then returned for one last look into the place between 12 and 14. The fog had thinned. The night looked closer to itself again, less smudged. The gap stayed gap-like, yet the sense of a shape within it lingered. No more, and no less than the line, "A closed book, leaves on a table." The next afternoon, when the sea threw a sharper chop under the bow, the crew laid out extra towels by the indoor pool and posted a second sign by the aft stair asking for handrails to be used. People obeyed. There are nights when ships ask for more obedient footsteps, nights when the water writes scripts and the captain and crew and passengers improvise within them. She felt that script under her palms on the rail that evening, the steel warm from the day and cooling with the hour. The light by the Station C plaque flickered once a tiny thing, the way LEDs sometimes stutter when a circuit settles. The flicker made the numbered plates seem to blink. 10, 11, 12, pause, 14. And in the pause, a flicker that did not quite match the others, not in brightness but in temperature, as if it had a memory of older bulbs, warmer at the edges. She thought of what the man had said, "There's a boat we don't see." She imagined it not as a ghost, but as an intention. The idea made her chest loosen in a way she had not expected. Weather changes fast at sea. People say this because they have been taught to say it, but also because it is true. Ships change too, always quietly adjusting little things so that big things remain as they should be. It felt to her that the ship had left itself an extra place to be ready, a placeholder in the world for a promise no one would need to call in. But that mattered simply because it existed, a kindness without an audience. On the sixth night, she dreamed with unusual clarity that she stood at Muster Station C and heard names. Not her name, names she didn't know. They were read aloud as if someone were checking they did not need to check, simply to honor something that happened elsewhere or elsewhen. She woke with the dream intact. Her room was the color of water before dawn. She rose and went to the balcony and counted the scarcer stars. In the distance, lightning stitched a horizon with thin white thread. Too far to hear, close enough to see. The ship went about its business, unfussed. Morning brought a line in the daily program about a crew drill to test doors. "No guest action required," it said with the cheerful efficiency of a line written for 100,000 eyes. At noon, she passed a corridor where a metal door had been propped, and two crew members with bright vests nodded to each other in rhythms, counting under their breath. The door closed with a sound she felt in her shoulder blades, not loud, satisfying the sound of something finding the place that was made exactly for it. That evening, the gap looked ordinary. That is to say, it looked like a blank, a nothing, an absence that had been respected long enough to be at peace. She stood there anyway. Sometimes the thing itself is not the point. The standing island. The list did not speak. The canvas did not stir. Yet she felt attended to, the way one feels when the person next to you in a dark theater leans forward at the same time you do because they, too, are interested. She did not bother anyone with her observation about the Station C map being wrong because it had been fixed. A tiny triangle arrow turned the right way in 1,000 printouts now. She did not bring up the gap to the staff who had other, real tasks. She carried it like a pebble with a nice weight in a coat pocket, touching it with thought sometimes, pleased by it. On the last night before land, the clouds thinned and drifted off as if tugged by something shy and enormous. The stars returned, busy and intricate. The sea deepened its color, even in the dark. There are shades to things you cannot see if you do not look for them. She walked the deck and listened to the tiny chorus of mechanical things singing their small notes. A thermostat's tick, a sensor's blink, a battery maintaining a glow for a sign. When she came to the gap, the dew on the rope again formed its intelligent pearls. She watched one swell. Before it fell, for a breath, she saw the surface it would have hit. Not steel, but something like a curve under a cover. The suggestion of a hull's gentle shoulder, present enough to catch a drop and let it run. It might have been a trick of the eye. So much out here is a trick of the eye. She smiled at the trick and let it be true long enough to say thank you inside, privately, to the ship for keeping places for things that cannot be listed. She left the deck feeling lighter than the wind deserved, rested in a way that had nothing to do with beds. Sleep came with the surety of a door closing correctly. Morning's tangle of luggage and announcements and dock cranes barely touched that feeling. People queued with practiced patience. Customs officers did their work without unnecessary drama. She glanced once more at the muster map by the stairwell on her way off, and saw the arrow exactly as it should be, pointing a small green figure the correct way. It looked glad to be useful rather than confusing. Beside it, someone had placed a little vase of white flowers, the sort of crew gesture that happens and goes unnoticed and makes everything nicer without making a sound. On the gangway, she paused and turned her head toward the lifeboat deck. 12 sat there, 14 sat there. Between them, a strip of shadow looked the way a bookmark looks when a book lies closed, hinting at the page it had held. The ship exhaled the way ships do when a voyage completes one of its tidy loops, and then inhales to begin the next. The shadow remained a shadow, content to be nothing and at the same time to be everything necessary. That night, far from the sea, she slept and dreamed a list that had no names in it, only the words, "All present," said twice, once for good measure. She woke, and in the stale city light, a bus hissed a note like a rope running through a gloved hand, a sound her ears, now trained, translated into gentleness. She turned on her side and listened. The silence in her room had a weight like canvas. A good weight. A held weight. The kind of weight that makes a promise about how, should a moment come, something made to carry, will do exactly that. Story number 5. They announced it at breakfast with cheerful certainty. Tonight the ship would turn time back by 1 hour. Please set your clocks from 2 o'clock to 1 o'clock, the program said in its friendly print. People made jokes about extra sleep and second desserts. The sun poured down on the pool in bright coins, and by evening the horizon looked like an ironed line. They had never minded time changes. On land, they adjusted and forgot. At sea, the notion felt grander. A whole ship deciding to inhale for an extra minute, an extra 60 of them, and then exhale again together. There's a ceremony in that. They wandered the decks after midnight, letting the hum in the steel guide their thoughts into a quieter lane. Somewhere below, laundry turned with the patience of planets. Somewhere above, the bridge watched its instruments, and the starless night with the grace of old stories. At 1:58, they stood near the atrium where the big brass clock hung above a sweep of stairs. The second hand ticked with confidence. The carpet's pattern seemed to hold steady, the kind of design that suggests waves without trying to imitate them. A couple laughed softly at a corner table. A bartender counted spoons. The ship moved, but it moved the way contentment moves. Not loudly. At 2:0. The second hand reached the upright and, delicately, moved backward. Not a jerk. A glide. The sound that came with it was like paper being smoothed, not quite a noise, more a permission. The digital display above the casino blinked once, and gave up a digit, yielding 1. 0 again with the modest pride of a trick done for a select audience. In that new one, 0, the room had the feel of a room that has just been tidied, even though no one had touched it. The bartender's row of spoons looked a little straighter. The chandelier's reflection in the glass railing shifted a degree warmer. A song drifted up from a lounge, something easy, a voice turning corners like a gentle car. They recognized it. They had heard it just before the clock had rewound, but now the singer stretched one note a shade longer, as if remembering a breath they hadn't taken the first time. Time changes on land can feel like bookkeeping. Here, it felt like a second draft. Their footsteps sounded familiar to their own ears. They wondered if they had already made them. They walked. The ship welcomed the stride. The hallway paintings behaved, except one, a photograph of the ship departing a foggy port that seemed to hold more sky than it had during the previous hour. The dining room at the atrium's edge was empty now, but the air carried cumin and star anise, as if a memory had leaned outward. At 1:07, the librarian in the small reading lounge stacked returns and, with a satisfied hum, flipped the sign to closed. They had seen her do exactly that when the clock had read 2:07. The stack of returns differed by a single book, a pale hardcover with a travel photograph. Either someone had slipped it in, or the evening had decided that in this version of the hour, that book belonged here. The librarian paused and tilted her head, the way one does when sure of something too tiny to justify stopping to explain it out loud. Then she smiled at her own certainty and locked the case. They passed the outdoor chessboard on deck 12. A knight lay toppled on black. Earlier, it had toppled on white. A gust pushed the pawns a fraction, and then, as if reconsidering, subsided. The ocean ate the moon in their imagination, because the moon hid behind cloud. The ship's rail at their palm felt like the side of a large animal in a good mood. At 1:15, near the elevators, a woman in a sequin jacket laughed into a phone and said, "Yes, I know it's the same hour, but it doesn't feel the same." And then listened, nodding, to whoever answered. The elevator chime reached for the right note and found it. Someone inside said, "Sorry," as a shoulder brushed a bag, and the apology landed sweeter than it had the last time. They couldn't have said why they knew that, and yet they knew. They went toward the cafe for tea and found it already closed down. A neat tray of cups, a pot hunkered warm in a sleeve. A night baker rolled by with a cart of proofed dough and stopped when he saw them, as if grateful for company. "Time change," he said with a small shrug and a grin that put a line by his eye. "The ovens always think it's the other minute. You have to meet them where they are." "Do you like the extra hour?" they asked. "The dough does," he said. "If we let it rest in the repeated bit, it remembers to be kind when heat comes. Bread listens." He pushed the cart on, and the wheels whispered their opinion of the floor. At 1:21, they took the stairs instead of the lift. A couple descended carrying a deck of cards, hands touching, their jokes soft and conspiratorial. In the landing, a potted plant looked greener than it had at the top of the hour, as if the ship were subtly watering things when no one looked. Time itself, a tin watering can tipped sideways for a second pass. They thought of going back to the atrium to watch the clock again, but kept walking. Time deserved privacy too. In their cabin corridor, a faint vibration ran through a door, as if a hairdryer had just been turned off exactly as it had at 2:23. They listened to the difference and failed, because the difference was the absence of difference. The ship carried some things along both versions of the hour without amendment, because they had been good enough already. On a quiet side deck, a small event unfolded, the sort of thing an extra hour is perfect for. A teenager in a hoodie bounced a ring between fingers, flick flick, startling the air into little leaps. The ring popped, kissed the deck, and began to roll. An elegant silver moon on a deliberate path toward the slender slit of a drainage grate. They had seen this before. At 2:24, the ring had touched one rib of the grate and paused like a tightrope walker, and then slipped down with the finality of a coin disappearing into a wishing well. There had been a lean forward, a whisper of a curse, a hand at the mouth, that guilty look a young person wears when thinking, "I've messed up in a way a future me and a present me will both scold me for." At 1:24, they were a step closer. They moved before the ring's edge lined up with its exit. One toe stopped it gently. No scrape, no show. "Careful," they said with a smile, pointing, and the teenager glanced up and laughed once in relief that had more gratitude than embarrassment in it. "Oh wow, thank you," the young voice whispered, sincere and a little stunned by unlost things. It felt small and ceremonial at the same time. They had not prevented disaster. They had changed a sentence from the version they had heard earlier. The version that belonged to 2:24 had a period of loss. This one had a comma of recovery. They left the deck feeling not heroic but included. The air smelled faintly of dough. The night baker's ovens were thinking it was 1:30, in whichever language ovens used to think. A few steps later, they noticed the sugar constellation on a cafe counter. At 2:27, they had watched a waiter carry a bowl too high, nearly collide with a swiveling door, and scatter a sigh of sugar into a small Milky Way. Now the bowl rode lower. The waiter leaned back half an inch sooner. The sprinkle did not occur. The counter gleamed blankly and somehow happily. Across the room, a security officer lifted a suitcase left by a door and tucked it out of the way with a gesture that felt practiced by this very hour. In the atrium, the big clock kept its second round of 1:30 with poise. The second hand ticked, as if pleased by the game. The gambling machines blinked, indifferent to time zones, loyal only to their own logic. A woman took the same photograph she had taken 40 minutes earlier, adjusted the angle by exactly the amount she had wished she had earlier, and smiled to herself. They found themselves back by the stairs without intending. The handrail was warmer now, as if a string of hands had passed recently. A crew member with a maintenance badge stood on a small ladder near a green emergency light, pressed a button that made the sign briefly glow brighter, and nodded to himself. "Good," he said under his breath. He bent to coil his cable more neatly than anyone would ever see. On a night like this, the coil wanted to behave. At 1:38, their phone insisted on being clever, and leapt forward an hour in protest at the ship's correction, then gave up and fell back again, as if embarrassed. The cabin television cheerfully reported 1:13. The hallway clock agreed with the ship. The person inside their phone was a land creature. The ship was water, blooded and calm. They wandered onto the promenade, a loop that always felt slightly longer on nights than days. A musician practiced in a glassed lounge that was closed to passengers, playing scales that sounded like notes testing the temperature of the air. A cleaner paused at the threshold of the aft door and waited for 3 seconds that kept the door from catching her with a gentle bump, a courtesy to herself learned in some fast lesson. She moved on. The ship admired her. At 1:44, a cluster of voices drifted from the karaoke bar. The same song as before, the same first lines. But then a second verse arrived, and the singer did not throw away a tricky note as she had earlier. She set it on a small shelf in the sound, and left it there for everyone to see. The applause had a different shape, now softer at the beginning, fuller at the end. They passed an art print of gulls flying over a harbor. At 2:46, one of the print's corners had lifted in the air conditioning sigh. At 1:46, a strip of double-sided tape did its work. No wing fluttered. The gulls kept flying over a harbor that did not age. At 1:50, they returned to the atrium. The clock had settled into its second statement of truth. A child sat on the stairs and tied a shoe with devastating concentration. The parent watched with patience that belonged to both versions of the hour. The second hand made its rounds. The child's bow came out neat enough to last until morning. Small corrections everywhere. The hour doing what a good teacher does. Not replacing, not scolding, only suggesting. They thought again of the baker's remark, "Bread listens," and wondered what else listened. Perhaps ships do. Perhaps the ocean has an ear for things that need a second chance. Perhaps that's why time bends out here and doesn't break. It bends like a branch under snow, and then the snow falls off, and the branch returns to shape, and the tree goes on. As the big hand began its climb to upright again, they felt the ship draw a breath that felt like the breath a person draws before blowing out candles. No wish, just the joy of exertion. The hand reached 12, the minute rolled. 1:59 coaxed itself into 2:0 as before, tidily. The brass face of the clock looked pleased with its behavior. The digital display above the casino accepted the new arithmetic. The lights held steady. The 2 hours lay side by side in their memory, overlapped like photographs where most things match and a few things do not, and the brain delights in finding both the sameness and the difference. They did not go looking for more. Enough was enough. They walked toward their cabin, past the door that had been left ajar earlier, and now closed with a click that felt correct. At their threshold, they paused. Inside, the quiet had become the particular quiet that follows an hour well used. They washed their hands, set their phone face down to keep it from arguing with clocks, and lay down. Sleep came with the neatness of a folded towel. Morning arrived with its busy sweetness, sun bluing the glass, an announcement in a bright voice about a beautiful day, pastries that tasted like good decisions. The daily program on the desk said, "We hope you enjoyed your extra sleep." And someone had added, maybe without meaning to, "and your extra things in general," because the sentence felt wider than sleep. They drank coffee and thought about the ring on the deck and the sugar that had not scattered, and the emergency light that had glowed for the person who might one day need it. They thought about time behaving like a helpful crew member, repeating the explanation without irritation, waiting until the listener nodded not because they'd been told to, but because they understood. Throughout the day, little echoes remained. A nap at noon felt richer than naps usually do. A conversation that might have tangented into something complicated stayed on a good track. A shoe that had squeaked stopped. A door that had required a hip bump learned to close with a friendly hush. That evening, walking again, they passed the big brass clock. It kept time, nothing fancy. They looked up and felt a peculiar tenderness for it, a softness usually reserved for photographs on a mantle, gratitude without ownership. They wondered about the nights ahead and behind, all the times this ship had adjusted its minutes, and all the tiny acts those minutes had made space for. Somewhere, in one of those doubled hours, a tray had been steadied. Somewhere, a wrinkle had been smoothed. Somewhere, a list had been read twice purely to make sure it didn't matter which reading you depended on. At sea, there are dangers in the world, and people prepare for them. But there are also these quiet measures, these small, nearly invisible kindnesses, built into structure and habit and night air. The extra hour had felt like a hand held out on a staircase. It had held no mysteries that asked for solving, and yet it had left behind the feeling that something understood them well enough to offer help before they knew to ask. When they disembarked days later, clocks no longer argued. Land time behaved. They looked once at a public clock in the terminal and thought of the ship's gentle backward glide. At home, when a kitchen timer stuck for a second and then resumed, they felt the warm recognition of an old friend in a crowded place. And sometimes, waking in the night and seeing a number on a digital display that they couldn't quite trust, they would breathe, count to 10, and listen for the quiet correction the air sometimes makes. The clock might be wrong, the hour might repeat, and if it did, they believed they would recognize it by the way it invited them to step, half an inch sooner or later, into a better version of the same moment. Story number 6. After midnight, the photo gallery looked like a sleepy orchard of glossy fruit. Rows of prints glowed under soft strips of light, faces and sunsets, and careful toasts, watching the quiet pass. The hum of the printers was gone. The upload stations blinked with well-fed contentment. Footsteps softened themselves on the carpet, and the glass cases along the wall held souvenirs as still as snow globes. He liked the gallery at that hour. In the day, it was noise and pointing and, "Oh, that one," and laughter that bounced off the ceiling. At night, it felt like the ship's memory cabinet, full of cheerful evidence that 100 small moments had chosen to be noticed. He walked slowly past the rails where the day's photographs hung. Children with painted faces, a couple on the formal staircase, someone pretending to push an ice sculpture that smiled back, live music framed in a warm blur. At the very end of the last rail, where the prints thinned, a photograph he had not seen before leaned awkwardly, as if it had arrived late and didn't want to ask for a better spot. It wasn't a portrait at all. It showed the promenade on Deck 7, completely empty, the sea flat beyond the glass. The angle was peculiar, slightly higher than a person would hold a camera, and a bit too centered. He glanced around. No photographer stood in wait. No camera lanyard dangled from a hook. He checked the time in his pocket, and then the tiny printed stamp in the corner of the photo. 1:8. He continued on. 4 frames later, another odd shot. The same stretch of promenade. The same angle. The same emptiness. The same cool illumination from the ceiling. This time, a single deck chair sat 2 inches off alignment with the others. The tiny stamp read 1:9. He looked down the rail and knew he'd missed something with his first glance. The last dozen spaces on the metal bar held nothing else but that view, repeated. Each print farther down shifted something by a hair. A napkin folded on a side table appeared in one and disappeared in the next. The automatic door at the far end showed a slice of black and then none. A puddle grew, then wasn't there. The timestamps climbed in a steady minute-by-minute ladder. It felt like standing over a strip of film pulled from its canister. He looked back up at the room, and then again at the last print in the series. It read 1:20 and showed a housekeeper's triangle sign standing near where the small puddle had been 2 frames earlier. No person appeared, no blur of motion, only the sign providing its yellow caution to an empty, perfect floor. He stood a moment longer and then, with the small cough one makes before speaking in an otherwise quiet place, turned to go. The night attendant in the gallery, a woman with a braid tucked like a rope above her collar, looked up from her ledger. "You see those?" she asked without needing him to point. It was the kind of tone people use when a thing is real enough to talk about, but shy enough to ask for gentleness. "They're security stills?" he suggested, keeping his voice low. She shook her head once. No feed prints at night. We don't pull those. We're not connected to that. She smiled in a way that felt like a steadying hand on a railing. Sometimes we do get sequences. Outliers. They go on the end. I'll take them down before breakfast, so nobody asks for them. They're not for sale. For who then? He asked, more curious than suspicious. They usually make sense after, she said. They're often of places that needed attending to. I think the ship likes to show its good work. She widened her eyes at herself, rueful. I sound dotty. Blame the hour. He took another slow pass along the rail. The puddle caught his attention again. He could hear the small slap of a glass set down too full earlier in the night, the almost silent cascade of ice as it surrendered. In the moment between 1:12 and 1:13 in the pictures, the glimmer on the floor expanded, then vanished, replaced at 1:15 by the triangle sign. Absolutely in place. He felt not startled so much as attended to, as if the corridor had caught its own sleeve and straightened it politely. He returned the next night. The gallery held its usual population of smiles and embraces, frozen but not uncomfortable. At the same far rail, the last spaces had filled with a new sequence. This time the angles changed. A wide shot of the atrium stairs, a ceiling camera's eye view of the pastry case, the rectangle of a hallway where the patterned carpet looked like waves moving in orderly columns. A time-stamped progression again, but finer now. 1:12, 1:50, 1:2. 30 seconds counted like stitches. In the second atrium shot, he saw a glass tilt on the railing just enough to roll and not enough to fall. In the third, a hand entered from the edge of the frame and set the glass upright, only the shape of a sleeve visible, pale, no face. In the pastry case sequence, an open door breathed, and then closed between frames, a paper corner fluttering and then still. The attendant, her name tag said Mara, watched him read the pictures, the way one reads. She didn't rush him. When he reached the end, she lifted the last print of the hallway and turned it over. On the back, in tiny gray lettering he had not noticed before, the ship's emblem wore a slightly older look. The font rounder, the funnel stripe thinner. It could have meant nothing. A misprint from old stock. He touched the paper with the back of a knuckle. It felt fresh, still carrying a whisper of warmth. Sometimes they're labeled, Mara said quietly. The first time this happened on my watch, there was a word on one. One word. Careful. The pictures that week kept coming, not nightly, but enough to become a rhythm. He found himself detouring past after the last piano set, after the pool had gone dark, after the cinema let out from its late show. The sequence on the third night moved like a gentle map from the aft lounge to the midship elevators. In one frame, the edge of a scarf became the subject, its end catching under a closing door, and then not, depending on the minute. He could feel the hush of avoided startle in his own chest as he turned to the next frame. Nothing about it was frightening, and yet he felt his body pay attention, the way it pays attention just before a porcelain cup reaches the saucer and can either clink or land as quietly as a touch. By the fourth night, people had begun to know he was the person you could ask in the minute between dancing and bed. Are there any tonight? As one might inquire about stars. He would say yes or no, not with authority but with shared interest. He was not in charge of the event. He merely liked to witness it. One evening, the sequence did something it had not done before. In a picture near the beginning, at 1:3:10, he saw a man with a cane pausing at a sign that pointed toward a lounge he himself had never visited. The same man appeared again at 1:4:2, the tip of his cane a half-inch closer to the Live Jazz arrow. In the third frame with him, the cane lay pressed against the man's knee, as if he had stopped to rest, and his face, though the photograph dissolved any hope of detail, turned halfway toward the camera, as if considering whether to ask. He recognized the man. He had seen him at breakfast, hunched gently over a newspaper that liked being read. At 1:7:22 in the sequence, a hand, not the man's hand, entered the picture and pointed toward the other sign, the one for the lift. The man, 1:7:45, turned his head. At 1:8:3, both hands were visible at once, the pointer's and the man's. That tiny choreography of direction and acceptance. before the man receded into the next open car. No faces, no conversation, just that nudge the smallest help caught and printed. He found the man in the morning, because the world had compressed itself sweetly on this voyage. On ships, the crowd is large and the paths are few. You eat breakfast near those you will somehow ride an elevator with. He told the story delicately, skipping no details except the ones that sounded like he'd developed a hobby of watching for phantoms. The man smiled, as if he'd been given a slice of cake, not on any menu. I wondered, he said. It felt like the hallway knew where I meant to go. I got there sooner. The pianist was still playing my song. Mara showed him how the printer behaved when these sequences arrived. It did not. That was the trick. Every other print required a command, a cue, a label. These appeared already cut, already dry, the corners neatly square, dropped into a plastic tray that did not exist for any other purpose. The machine did not admit to having been involved. Sometimes, between one blink and the next, a new print lay where there had been none. The ship was full of machines that made sense. This procedure refused to. He did not tell anyone who would need it to make sense. He told the people who understood the notion of a ship having moods. A tenor from the show band came in yawning, and, seeing a sequence of photographs of the theater curtains, their edges moving in almost imperceptible ripples, he said, "Ah, that yes." They breathe when the air settles. If the folds relax, the flies relax. The line won't catch. He tapped a frame with gentle knuckles. Of course, it would show off a bit. On the sixth night, the images carried a notice to him in particular, which would have felt like presumption if he hadn't felt gently singled out by other oddities lately. He had grown fond of the stairs by the smoking lounge because they always smelled faintly of wintergreen. In the sequence that night, 1:5:31 showed those stairs. 1:6:12 showed a shadow at the landing, thin and leaning. 1:6:50. One showed the landing empty again, and a reflection in the glass panel. His own shape caught at a distance by the glass's will to be a camera every so often. He stood in front of the photograph under the gallery light and felt what a photograph can make you feel when it lets you see yourself from the outside. Gratitude, embarrassment, tenderness. The reflection in the print wore a scarf he did not own. He took the stairs in the flesh on his walk and paused at the landing. Wintergreen came forward, as if it had waited. In the glass panel, for a second only, he saw the scarf around his neck. A moment later, it was his own coat collar, and nothing more. He touched his throat, laughed at himself softly, and looked around. No one needed anything at that moment. He continued down. A minute later, someone came rapidly around the corner below. A scarf flapped past his outstretched hand harmlessly. If he had not paused, the scarf could have smudged him in the face and made them both flinch. Nothing heroic, nothing large, only that small thing not happening. Mara began to keep a box behind the counter, a place for the sequences after the night, so she could clear the rails before the day's frames went up. The box wasn't full. Some mornings the images were gone when she lifted the lid. She shrugged about it the way one shrugs about tides. Maybe they go wherever the ship keeps its extra bolts and its old menus, she said. We have a closet for things that exist and a closet for things that have done their job. He asked to keep one. It seemed fair to ask. He chose an image that showed a sun hat lying on its brim just inside a doorway. In the next frame along the rail, a little hand reached and claimed it. He liked the way the hat's ribbon looked like a held breath. Mara flipped it over and frowned with concentration. On the back, in the tiny lettering where a stock number should have been, someone had printed, "Return to stateroom 7123. It wasn't a number he recognized. He could have gone to a phone, but the ship was small in the ways that matter. He walked the corridors. He knocked once, softly, at 7123. A woman with a book opened the door and smiled a question at him. He held up the print. She laughed, put a palm to her chest, and said, "I was just wondering where that hat had gone." It had not been lost at all. Not in any angry way. It had simply drifted, as things do. The photograph had been a map for a very minor treasure. By then, a rumor had settled like a polite cat. The gallery was sometimes a place you could visit to see what the ship had done for you that you didn't know to notice. People came with the manner of those walking through a chapel after service. Quiet, appreciative, not demanding. A boy looked at a sequence of the arcade room door and nodded as if a private question had been answered. A woman glanced at a frame of the spa's water wall and put her hand to her shoulder with the softness of someone who has just remembered to lower it. The last sequence of the voyage arrived on a night so still the sea looked like skin. The images were wider, as if a different lens had been borrowed for an hour. The forward deck appeared first. Empty. The bow still in the next, a promise of light pooling at the horizon line as dawn prepared to happen. In the third, two figures stood there. One taller, one shorter, near a rail. The wind never quite forgot to touch. Their faces blurred again into the protective anonymity these frames always offered. The minute marks moved along like beads on a string. The two figures came beside each other, and then apart, and then together again, the way people move when they are in the middle of saying something true and must look at the sea because it is easier than looking directly at each other. He watched 4 more prints pass the scene forward to the edge of morning. A gull entered the 5th frame and left by the 6th. In the last 2, the shorter figure had held up a phone. The taller had forgotten to smile and then remembered. The final image showed only the empty deck again, the sun a thought becoming practice. He turned that one over, because something about last images asks for the back. There was a word, small and steady, printed where a stock number would be. Keep. Mara slid the photograph into a sleeve as if she were putting something delicate to bed. "We don't sell them," she said again, but her mouth tilted toward kindness. "Sometimes a $0 receipt looks fine in a drawer." She typed something into her terminal and tore a stub. The description line read, "Print unclaimed sunrise 0. He tucked it into his wallet and felt absurd and unreasonably moved about a picture of nothing. He stood on the forward deck at dawn the next morning anyway. It seemed courteous to match the print with the place. The deck crew hosed the salt from the planks with the thoughtful arcs good sweepers use. A couple stood at the rail, quiet, friendly strangers to him and he to them. A gull tried its best to be useful and failed. When the first light gathered into being, the sea accepted it the way skin accepts warmth from a window. He put his hand on the rail and felt the ship's soft pulse, the engine doing the work people's bodies do for them in sleep. On disembarkation day, the gallery had replaced all the displays with the next voyage's blank rails and polished glass. The printers stood ready. The place where the mysterious tray lived looked like a normal shelf. He said goodbye to Mara with the specific gratitude passengers feel for the crew whose names they have learned. "Thank you for letting me watch," he said. She waved it off and didn't, both at once. "Come back," she replied, which could have meant any ship, any year. The pictures always have their own ideas. He slipped the dawn print into the back of his notebook, and at home, would find it again in a moment when the day asked for softness. Some nights, waiting for sleep, he would see in his head not the faces and poses meant for framing, but the empty corridors, the sign angled just so, the cup catching the edge of a table and staying on, the little adjustments, the ship's small courtesies caught in time, and then released. The feeling they left behind was a kind of polite, haunting, an echo of attention. People tell stories about mirrors and music and footsteps at sea. On that voyage, a quiet printer had chosen to make its own genre. A minor documentary of near misses smoothed before anyone noticed, of kindnesses performed almost invisibly, of corridors watched over by a camera angle no one had ordered, and a timestamp nobody had assigned. It was the cleanest kind of shiver, the gentlest kind of mystery. An invitation to see how many small things go right in a night while a ship moves forward, as if that were the most natural and lovely thing in the world. Story number 7. He went walking to quiet his head. The corridors at that hour were soft and long, a kind of indoor tide that flowed around corners. Carpets with their gentle wave patterns drank up footfalls. The air held lemon and clean cotton. Doors wore their numbers like polite name tags that glowed faintly in the dim. Behind walls, the ship hummed, as if speaking to itself, a steady voice that kept watch while people slept. His cabin sat near the bend between midship and aft. He liked that bend. It made the hall feel like a sentence with a comma that gave you time to breathe. He set out past 6,103, 6,105, 6,107, pleased by the soothed logic of odd numbers on one side, evens on the other. He turned the corner, expecting the red fire door with its round window that always showed a square of night. The door waited for him. He glanced through. The round window wore the sea like a coin. Dark, glossy, simple. He pushed the handle down and stepped through. The next segment of hallway felt 3 paces longer than usual. A strange thing to notice, and yet he did. The carpet's waves pointed toward his direction of travel, where by day they pointed toward the lifts. He walked on, amused by his own attention. The numbers slid past. 6,111, 6,113, 6,115. The corridor turned again, the exact same angle. He looked ahead and saw the same fire door, the same round window, the same coin of night. His pace slowed. He pressed the handle and went through again, putting his palm on the cool bar with a deliberate calm anyone might use to avoid spooking a cat. The next stretch of hall had a painting on the wall he had never liked too much: beige water, a harbor that refused to be anywhere in particular. Tonight the beige had surrendered some of its color to shadow. Beneath it, the safety placard nodded in its frame. He checked the cabin numbers because numbers were friendly. 6,111, 6,113, 6,115. He smiled despite himself. The ship, it seemed, was playing at symmetry. He moved, and the carpet's waves kept pointing his way, or perhaps he had imagined their direction an hour ago. He came to the fire door a third time. He stood in front of the round window and watched his own shoulder move in the glass. He lifted a hand and felt the impulse to tap twice, absurdly, as if checking whether this was his door or a door in a photograph. A soft clink came from behind it, the sound glassware makes when a cart slips over a join in the floor. A quadrant of darkness in the round window quivered, not with movement on the other side, but with the ship's own small sway. He pressed the handle and stepped through. On the other side, a carpet seam ran crosswise that he had never noticed in daylight. He paused and bent, barely, not wanting to seem like someone searching for coins. The seam was neat. The pattern matched perfectly, except for one little triangle where the weaver had chosen a slightly different shade of blue. He straightened and glanced left and right. The beige harbor painting had been replaced by a photograph of the ship's bow lifting through a low swell. No, not replaced. Repeated. He decided not to decide which it was. Lost? Asked a voice, gentle and professional. A night steward stood by a service door, hands together, months of kindness folded in. He wore the expression of someone who solves small puzzles as routine. A name tag read, Dimas. Behind him, the service door breathed a cooler air that smelt of soap and the ever-present lemon. Just walking, he said with a small laugh that wanted to sound unbothered. The corridor seems longer than it should be. Sometimes it stretches, Dimas said, as if they were discussing a rubber band. It is the hour. We do work with doors. The ship does not want people to run into buckets. He glanced at the fire door. Dimas followed his eyes and added, Leave it open when you pass, just for a moment. That is enough. He smiled a little, as if sharing a secret that could be trusted with a stranger. He pushed the handle, stepped through, and this time did not let the door close. It pressed against his palm like a well-trained animal that wanted to return to heel. He held it, counted to 5, and then walked on before it shut with its usual polite hush. The corridor beyond looked exactly itself again. The carpet's waves pointed toward the lifts. The beige harbor returned, resigned. The numbers ascended, odd, odd, odd. He turned the corner. The fire door had moved back to where it belonged. His shoulders released. He laughed softly at himself, and the hour, and the ship. On the next night's walk, the corridor played a new variation. The numbers were fine. The air was fine. He passed the bend and the painting and the round window and continued, aware in his bones the way people are on long hallways of precisely how far their legs had carried them. He reached his friend's door 6,127, paused to listen for a snore that would mean his friend had surrendered to sleep, and then continued. The lift lobbies breathed their brighter light. He turned toward the open deck and pushed the big metal latch. The door did not budge. "Out of service," said a tiny electronic display far above eye level, a rectangle the size of a thumb. He did not remember it being there before. He put his ear to the door out of a child's habit. Beyond it, the wind sang the thin sound it makes when pushed through a narrow place. He turned back toward his cabin and walked. 6,127, 6,125, 6,123, 6,121. The numbers stepped down as he expected. At 6,117, the corridor turned into itself, a U where a hyphen should be. He found himself back at 6,127, without having walked the intervening distance. He put his palm to the wall as one does when seasick, though he was steady as a table. The paint was cool. Behind it, something shivered politely, pipes settling, air choosing. His mind offered him, unhelpfully, the idea that perhaps the ship had chosen to fold the hallway like paper, so night crew could pass with less detour. "You are not the only one," said a voice, not Demas this time, but a woman with a radio clipped to her belt and a loop of keys that sounded like coins. She had the brisk kindness of those who have grown skilled at balancing chatter and quiet. "After midnight, we change a section for cleaning," she explained, tapping the ceiling with her fingertip. "It's easier to keep guests flowing to lifts. If you want to pass, follow the carpet triangles with the light point." She bent, pointed, and he saw what she meant. In the blue curls of the woven pattern, the smallest triangles hid, their points catching more light from the low ceiling fixtures. He had never noticed. "Keep them on your left," she said. "When they switch to your right, you'll know you've passed the fold." He followed the tiny geometry and, sure enough, found himself in front of the vending nook without taking the loop again. He bought water he did not need, and marveled at himself for wanting to leave a coin in the slot just to see whether it would come back to him the way ours sometimes do on ships. He kept his money and his water and his wits, and returned to his cabin calm. It became a game over the next few nights. Not a game he told anyone about at dinner. A private one, played quietly, like solitaire. Some nights the ship stretched the hall to give room to a steamer of linens. On others, a blue-lit cordon made a sideways move into the path, inviting a detour by way of a stair that had always been there and never been needed. He learned the ship's visual grammar, the way one learns the meaning of a friend's raised eyebrow. The carpet's triangles, the temperature of the light over a service hatch, the subtle difference in the hum of a lift when it slept and when it listened. He left himself a test one night. He slid a paper napkin into the seam under the fire door like a shy flag. When he returned a half hour later, the napkin had moved 3 inches to the right and folded itself where the door had trimmed it. He stared at the neat crease and felt, absurdly, like he had been scolded for leaving a mess. He picked up the paper, folded it twice more into a square, and tucked it into his pocket, chastened by a door. He began to notice another oddity. In certain stretches, the cabin numbers wore their light differently. A warm tone on one side, a cool tone on the other, as if day and night had been distributed along the corridor. It made the evens recede, and the odds come forward like steps in a photograph. He passed 6,110, which had always looked much like any door, and paused. Under the number plaque, a faint outline showed where a previous shape had lived 2 screw holes slightly further apart, a ghost of an older font that shouted rather than whispered. He laid his finger against the paint and felt the smoothness where new met old. The refit had been thorough, but not absolute. The hallway remembered. He looked back down the line of doors and imagined the previous numbering, the previous arrangement, the ship in an earlier suit, its pockets elsewhere. On a whim, he tried the handle at 6,110, and then immediately stepped back, realizing his hand had moved before his manners. He whispered an apology to the sleeping person he would never meet. In the glass of the fire door, his reflection met his gaze with that odd delay one sometimes experiences in slow, quiet light. He tilted his head, and the other him tilted a shade later. He smiled and walked on. The night after the small storm, the kind that gives the pool a silver skin and makes the sun deck crowd a funnel of fresh air, he found a magnetic arrow sign lean near the wall by the lift. The arrows usually pointed toward muster stations during drills. This one had been set down to rest. It wore the ship's logo in a route it no longer used, a thin stripe on the funnel. He left it alone. The corridor did its folding trick again near 6,121. He felt, in the bones of his legs, the way the floor shifted under certain doors, not in height, but in tone. Somewhere above, a wire made a clean, single-plucked note. He followed the carpet triangles. Left side, right in there, the fold ended. He was not the only creature checking the hall at absurd hours. A cat from the ship's stories. That is to say, an imagined one, because modern ships do not keep cats, seemed to pad along with him in his mind. A soft attendant, approving of his attention to corners. Once he passed Demas, and they exchanged a nod that felt like a handshake given by two people who have patrolled a perimeter together and found it in good order. Sometime in the middle of the voyage, a small sign appeared near the bend, a laminated card tucked discreetly at knee height. In polite black text it read, "Corridor adjustments may occur overnight. Please follow directional arrows and enjoy a safe stroll." The sentence was so calm and bland that it made him want to laugh. The ship had put up a sign that translated to, "We rearrange ourselves the way a sleeping person shifts on a pillow. If you find yourself in the middle of one of our adjustments, stand still for a small count and then keep going." He thought of how many buildings would have struggled with that truth. Ships are good at admitting what they are. The most curious night came near the end, when the ship steamed quietly toward a harbor that would be there in the morning like a politely dressed parade. He left his cabin and found the corridor returning the favor of familiarity. Carpet patterns pointed him toward lifts. The fire door breathed its round windows sea. At the far end, a pair of double doors stood closed, where normally they lay open like friendly arms. The sign on them said simply, "Crew." Below, a smaller placard had been left pinched under a magnet, temporary enough to speak softly, "Night transit." He did not push those doors. He did not want to. Through the small window he could see a slice of the long crew corridor that runs the length of large ships like a backbone, patient and practical. A cart went by beyond, silent on its wheels. A shadow of a person passed, then another. They moved with the quiet authority of choreography done 1,000 times. He stepped back because it felt respectful to do so. As he did, the corridor behind him gave the smallest little shiver, like linen settling over a bed someone had just left. When he turned around again, the double doors were open, and the smaller magnet sign gone. The space was itself once more. He laughed at the neatness of the trick, at the ship's good manners, at his own relief. On the last night, he timed his walking to the exact moment the captain's soft, routine announcement floated out of the ceiling in the public spaces the next day's weather. The kind words about crew, the estimated arrival, the voice had become a lullaby on the voyage. As the message ended, the corridor near his cabin seemed to exhale. The little fold vanished. The carpet arrows looked uniformly lazy, not pointing anywhere at all. He stood under the only exit sign he had never seen flicker and felt, deep in the body, a kind of gratitude he couldn't have put into better words than these. The ship knew where to bend and when to lean back into its full, straight shape. He went to bed and slept as if he had been rocked by something 1,000 miles long and thoroughly invested in his dreams. In the morning, people rolled suitcases with a rhythm the deck learned to echo. He walked past the bend toward the gangway with his hand gliding along the rail, casual, affectionate. The beige harbor painting glowed in daylight. The photograph of the bow looked braver than it had at night. The numbers on the doors did their cheerful work. Near the fire door, where that funny seam crossed the carpet, a tiny piece of string lay tied to the baseboard. He stopped and smiled at it. A loop no bigger than a ring, a knot anyone could undo. The kind of thing one might leave on purpose to see if it would still be there later. He did not touch it. The ship would know what to do with it. Weeks afterward, on land, he would walk a hallway in a hotel and feel a brief certainty he had gone the wrong way, only to find, with a gentle wobble in his chest, that he had arrived faster by trusting his feet. He would look down and find a pattern in the carpet, and keep that pattern on his left, out of habit. Like someone who learned a new alphabet and finds himself reading signs in 2 languages at once. He would think of Demas and the steward with the radio and the ship that folded its hull the way a mother's hand adjusts a blanket at 2 in the morning. He would keep how it felt close by. Not trapped, but guided. Not spooked, but looked after. Not mazed, but moved. Out at sea, Things much larger than people adjust themselves to keep us walking in a straight, safe line. Sometimes if one listens, one can hear the door whisper its small hush as it closes properly behind you, and the hallway decide to be exactly the right length again. Story number 8. She found the theater by following the hush. After midnight, when the pool lights mellowed and the boutiques folded their mirrors to sleep, the ship's big room of velvet and brass became a different kind of ocean. Rows of seats flowed down like waves, the aisles a pair of long inlets, the stage a dark shoreline with curtains closed as close as a secret. One light remained. It stood alone on a simple stand, an old-fashioned bulb in a metal cage, plugged into an orange cable that snaked off stage. It cast a small pond of warm gold on the boards. She had seen shows there every evening, the comedian who balanced gentle jokes on quieter pauses, a singer who could turn a standard so softly it felt like untying a ribbon, dancers who moved like wind. After the last bow, an usher had once told her, "We leave a ghost light on stage at night. It's tradition. It keeps the stage from being empty." She had smiled at that. The word sounded kind on a ship at sea. Now, in the deep version of the hour, she slipped into the back row and watched the light. It did nothing dramatic. Sometimes the best things don't. Dust motes drifted through it like ideas. She closed her eyes and, through her lids, saw the color change from amber to a deeper orange when the ship turned, and the house lights across the way reflected differently on the bulb's small world. Somewhere beyond, in the wings, something let out a patient sigh the way fabric does in a room that has just remembered to rest. "Careful of the step," said a quiet voice at the aisle. She opened her eyes to find the stage manager, Lena, according to the badge standing 2 rows down, a coil of tape looped around her wrist. Lena had that attentive stillness people who cue things develop, the way they listen to the air for the moment in which to press a button that makes magic look effortless. "I'm not supposed to be here?" she asked, embarrassed at once. "You're fine," Lena said with a soft smile that lived just at the corner of her mouth. "I was finishing a check. The light keeps us honest." She tilted her head toward the stage. No one falls off a stage if the stage is never entirely dark. They stood in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that counts as conversation. "It looks placed," she said. "Not just left." Lena nodded. "We spike it," she said, pointing to a tiny X of tape near the stand's feet. "Same mark every night." She laughed a little low. "And sometimes it drifts back to where it wants to be." The next night, the light stood 3 boards further upstage than its tape X. She noticed because the shadow it threw on the curtain pooled differently. The curtain looked deeper there, like the sea when a cloud chooses it. In the small beam's reach, she saw a cable lying just where the light would have been if it had landed on its mark. She rose, stepped down the aisle with the care people reserve for empty theaters, and peered. The cable looped like a sleeping cat, perfectly harmless if seen. A sure trip if not. Lena appeared again, from the house left wing this time, her tape looped at her belt. "Ah," she said, seeing the cable and then the light, and then the stand where it had not been. "That's on me." She stooped and coiled the line with a tender exactness that made it neat, then tucked it into the wing with the back of her hand. The bulb's little world hummed, pleased, or maybe it was the ship under the floor. "Sometimes it tells us where to look," Lena said, as if confessing a superstition she'd chosen to keep because it made the work sweeter. On the 3rd night, a soft swell taught the ship a new rhythm. People walked a shade wider. Glasses chimed a shade more. She drifted to the theater by habit, thinking she would only check on the pool of light and then go keep company with stars on the aft deck. The light stood at the very lip of the stage. Proscenium left. Its circle spilled onto the carpet by the orchestra pit, as if it could not be contained to one surface. She paused at the end of the row. 2 stairs led down to the front aisle, steps she had descended a dozen times without thinking. Here, now, a thin sheen glowed on the landing, that invisible varnish a spilled drink leaves behind even after someone has done their best with a napkin. She slowed. The warm circle on the carpet grazed the edge of the slick place just so, enough to suggest it without illuminating it like a scold. She put out a hand for balance that she did not need, took a slower step, and passed without sliding. At the far aisle, a crew member rounded the corner carrying a ladder, upright, a neat column taller than the person. She stopped at once when she saw that anyone else occupied the space. They both smiled. The light looked very proud of itself, which is to say it didn't change at all. On the fourth night, the light wasn't there. Or rather, it wasn't there when she looked from the back. The stage lay in the soft dark of late hours, the curtains held with the exact relaxation of a serious person smiling for a portrait. She walked down the aisle and stood where the glow would have fallen, and found herself in a comforting, ordinary dusk. When she turned, she saw a blush of gold from behind a door to the house-left corridor. The lamp's small world had rolled off stage altogether and taken up station in the wing. She followed, not far, just enough to see. Backstage had its own atmosphere, tight, practical air, a smell of paint and wood warmed by lights, the geometry of ladders and flats that made sense at a glance if you knew how to read them. The ghost light she had begun to let herself think the word the way Lena had said it stood beside a stack of folded risers. Someone had set a small plastic cone behind them as a reminder not to wheel anything too close. The lamp seemed to agree, its circle drawn right up to the cone, offering its little glow to the caution. Sometimes when the sea is lively, we give the stage a bit of room, Lena said from somewhere in the wing. And sometimes the light chooses its own room. A grin. I don't mind being assisted. At breakfast the next morning, the daily program included a small note near the bottom. Please use handrails when moving through venues this evening, as we expect a gentle swell. We thank you for your care. She thought of the glow on the landing and felt perfectly, disproportionately proud of a lamp. The fifth night, she listened before she entered. The theater has its own way of breathing. The ship amplified its small, constant adjustments in the big bones of the room, air through vents humming like far music, seat cushions giving and reclaiming a fraction of an inch. The light stood mid-stage, exactly on its spike. She took her usual place in the back, and saw that a page lay on the floor within the circle, a piece of score paper, the bars marching straight. Someone had left it behind. The notes rode the staff like small birds on a wire. When she circled down and picked it up, she saw, in the corner, in pencil, the words, "Not too fast, please." She set the page on the edge of the stage, where the morning would easily see it. It felt like setting a teacup back on the saucer it missed. Another night, the house seats whispered. Not voices rises and settles. The springs within sang their soft syllables as invisible forces of temperature and tiny shifts made fabric and foam remember different shapes. She would have thought nothing of it except the pattern. One seat, two down the row, another two up. One again a shape she could trace with her finger in the air. She thought of old light plots, the way desks in the booth map a night's illumination to small glowing buttons. A moment later, the overhead aisle light warmed itself for a breath, and then cooled. She had the feeling she had witnessed a cue called and answered, even though the show was over and the night belonged only to sleep. Lena told her a story in the thick midnight. That wasn't one. On a ship I worked before, she said, perched on the edge of a front row seat with her headset looped around her neck. The bulb blew during a crossing. We had spares, but we took longer than we should to get to it because of something with water curtains upstairs. That night I had a dream that the light stood in the aisle by the second exit right there, see? And in the morning we found a heel tip from someone's shoe, tiny, like a dropped comma, exactly in that spot. The person never tripped because we found it before the matinee. I replaced the bulb before my coffee, and I've never left it unfed since. She nodded. It seemed only right that a ship would have ways of reminding. You never leave lights hungry. You never leave people in the dark longer than they can rest in. On a night after a lovely performance, an illusionist who made scarves and flowers behave like ideas. She cut through the theater to save 10 steps on the way back to her cabin. The light shone in an unexpected place, not on the stage at all, not in the wing, but out in the aisle halfway up, its cord safe along the carpet runner, its cage glowing like a bedside lamp in a long room. She waited before passing it, feeling suddenly like a guest in someone's home. The light illuminated nothing in particular, except a small scuff in the carpet and the edge of a forgotten program folded under a seat. She bent to fetch the paper. It was not a program. It was a card from the ship, a pale cream square with a compass watermark faint as breath. The type beneath said, "Please take the side aisle tonight. Equipment transit will use the center." She looked up. No one stood nearby. She turned and saw down the center aisle the shape of a flight case rolling. smooth and black and quiet, tall as a wardrobe on wheels. The crew at its corners kept their eyes on their hands, and their hands on the corners. She stepped to the side aisle. The case drifted past with inches to spare, and none of the small scrapes people forgive in tight spaces. The light approved by gleaming, as it always did, which is to say, without comment. The lamp was not always dramatic. One evening, it simply offered its circle to a bent metal corner on a music stand that someone had pulled a little too close to the pit. Another night, it found the exact edge of a slight dip in the stage where a set's weight had left an honest dent. Lena and a carpenter knelt and murmured, in that loving language techs use with wood and screws. Once, the light rested neatly by the iron curtain control, as if keeping it company. On the second to last night, when they were 3 sleeps from land and the sea's breath had slowed to a sweet rhythm, a thin fog found them. It came into the theater through the doors when people opened them, bringing the smell that isn't a smell, just cool and damp and old in a kind way. The light made its own halo in that air. She sat and watched it until the fog took the halo away and then gave it back, the way a curtain can hide a face and reveal it with equal kindness. She heard applause from somewhere, and realized it was the sound of a mophead leaving the stage for a rinse. She smiled at herself in the hour. She did not look for the light on the final midnight. She meant to say her goodbyes to the sea on the open deck, but on her way past the theater, the double doors at the back were propped open with wedges like bookends. She glanced in and saw darkness. No glow. She paused to listen, the instinct again, the attention the ship had taught her. There, in the other aisle, a soft, almost domestic brightness. The lamp had been rolled into the passage by the side exit, its circle occupying just enough space to make a person slow and notice. She walked toward it and then stopped. Beyond the door, the service corridor to the forward lounge took a right angle. She heard wheels and soft voices, a crew team guiding a backdrop roll, long and finicky and happiest when no one else used the same turn. The lamp waited, small and sure, and then, when the team had turned the corner and disappeared like a train into a tunnel, the bulb flickered once, bright, as if a person had sighed with relief. She had not moved. She had not needed to. The light had done the asking for her. Pause, just here, for just this long, and everything will be as it should. In the morning, the theater smelled like a lightly ironed jacket. Seats looked crisp. The stage wore its best face. A custodian polished the brass handrail at the aisle with the sort of care usually found in taking fingerprints off a photograph. On a stand at center, the ghost light waited unplugged, its cord coiled, its cage cool. It looked like a singer who has given a small private concert and is now content to be quiet. Lena waved from the wings and then pointed to the floor where 4 tiny X's of tape, old and new, overlapped like a family portrait. "We'll pull the extras," she said. "No reason to confuse the day. The night knows what it knows." On land later, she bought a lamp for her living room, nothing dramatic, a warm bulb in a simple shade. Some nights she left it on when she went to bed, and the room felt less empty in the same way the ship's theater had felt less empty with its single friendly planet of light. Every so often, in the corner of her eye, she thought she saw the circle of brightness hesitate at the edge of a book on the rug, or the angle of a table leg, a tiny suggestion a room makes to a person who is listening. Watch your step. Turn this way. Wait 1 count more. She would smile, move aside, and the moment would pass like the tide, with the same quiet rightness. Back on the ship, perhaps on another voyage, someone else would wander into the theater and peer at the small lamp, and feel the good weight of being looked after by a tradition that learned how to be more than tradition. The bulb would burn with modest patience. The aisle would hold its air very gently. The sea would press itself against the hull like a hand through a sleeve, ready to carry, ready to be carried, keeping its own counsel, remembering each small circle of light that left the world better ordered when morning came. Story number 9. The spa belonged to the ship in a different way after midnight. Daytime voices vanished into folded robes and closed lockers. Light dimmed to a warm dusk. The long tiled room breathed eucalyptus and ocean salt. Heated loungers held their slow, even warmth like stones at the edge of a river. Water whispered in a wall, a ribbon of sound that smoothed the mind's edges. Past a glass door, the steam room exhaled and gathered itself again, a living cloud in a tiled shell. She liked it then, when the hour held its breath. Her pass allowed late entry, A night attendant at the desk looked up, smiled with the serenity of someone guarding a library, and returned to a soft-turned page. The corridor to the thermal suite curved with the ship's ribs. Beyond, the world reduced itself. Tile, glass, air, water, and her heartbeat, steadying to the engine's hush. When she touched the steam room handle, letters bloomed on the inside of the fogged glass. They did not smear like a finger's trace. They appeared all at once, as if the idea of a word had condensed into shape. Wait one breath. She paused, almost laughing at the gentleness of the command. The door on the far side pushed inward a second later, an attendant rolling a bucket that would have clipped her ankle had she entered on habit. He nodded, grateful for the near miss he did not know had been avoided, and the word dissolved into a soft, formless dew. Inside, the steam was a kind hand. It wrapped shoulders and thoughts. She sat, counted a breath because the glass had asked her to, and watched the cloud gather and thin. On the pane opposite, a shape arrived that was not quite writing an arrow curved toward a lower bench space that would be cooler. She moved there and felt the difference, small but kind, like someone tipping a shade. The next night she noticed the writing earlier. "Bring water," said the fog in soft strokes near the door where paper cups nested in a tower. She took one. In the steam, a line drew itself like a string along the glass at shoulder height. She shifted and avoided the hottest ribbon of air that traveled that level. Tiny courtesies kept appearing and dissolving. Cool feet before tile. Count 4, then open. Sit where light is shallow. Each suggestion arrived at the moment it would be most welcome, not a second earlier, not a bossy word too late. "Vents make mischief," the attendant said when she asked. The name on her badge read Amma. When the sea is damp, the glass behaves like a notebook. Someone could have written earlier. The room remembers. She said it with a smile that left plenty of room for other explanations. Either way, it helps. She began to greet the room under her breath, the way one greets a cat that may or may not be listening. The spa answered in its chosen language. In the sauna, where wood held the day's heat and gave it back in a longer sentence, the sand timer turned itself a degree while no one looked, enough to catch her eye. "Rest," said the fog in the upper corner of the glass, the strokes rounder somehow. Patient. She let her shoulders fall by an inch she hadn't realized she'd been holding. On a night when the sea wore fog like a veil, the windows looking out to the dark returned only her reflection and the lamp pearls of the deck. Inside, the pane by the cold plunge offered a different view. A set of faint arcs, like ripples drawn in pencil. The curves pointed to the mat's textured edge. "Use the mat," breathed the glass. She had been about to put a damp foot on smooth tile. She set it on the mat and felt safe in a way that reached deeper than toes. She tried one evening to write back. With one finger, she attempted a small thank you near the hinge. The letters came out clumsy, all drips and hesitation. The room took them, blurred them, and returned a clearer phrase a moment later, lower, where she almost missed it. "You're welcome," or perhaps she only saw it because she wanted to. Yet the strokes held a confidence no clumsy finger could have drawn. She told no one but Amma, who listened with the warm skepticism of a person well acquainted with both plumbing and wonder. "I've seen it worn about a loose tile," Amma said, pointing to a place now fixed. A word appeared exactly there. Mind. The maintenance team appreciated the heads up. Another night, the glass wrote "Closer robe on C." She looked along the hooks. A breeze found the corridor each time the exterior door sighed open for someone heading to the deck. Hook C hung tucked from that path by the slimmest of angles. She moved her robe. Later, the gust came through. The other hooks swayed like grass. Hers stayed still. Sometimes the messages were not words. Constellations of clear circles bloomed amid dew, then arranged themselves into arrows made of absence. Once, a row of ovals rose and fell like breath. She matched them without meaning to, and felt her chest behave like a calm metronome. Once, a single dot gleamed, and waited exactly where the latch would be least hot to the fingers. Once, a faint outline shaped like a palm suggested where to place her hand on the stone for a sweeter warmth. She began to time her visits by the ship's softer sounds. The quiet verification chime from the corridor's security panel, the whisper of a mop, the muted, polite thunk of a rolling cart slowing at a threshold. The writing seemed clearest in the moments between those notes. It never scolded. It never told her to hurry. It made room for her. On the penultimate night, the ship rocked with the small lullabies of open water. In the steam, a longer sentence appeared than any before. If you feel unsteady, sit near the door. She did, and in the moment a larger roll passed under the hull, the door's wood offered her a steadying shoulder. A second message joined the first, simpler. Breathe. She laughed, a sound that steamed and vanished. She left the spa as a different person leaves a room slower, aware of thresholds. Near the towels, a folded card had been tucked discreetly on a stack. Cream with a faint compass rose in the paper itself. The print said, "We hope you rest well." The ship borrowed the sea to teach this lesson. She pressed the card to her heart in an exaggerated way that made no sound and let it go back to the pile. On the last midnight, she picked a lounger and lay with a cool cloth over her eyes. The water wall whispered its clear syllables. The glass door sighed. When she sat up, the steam room pane wore a final reply shaped with the confidence of script. Good night. The letters were high enough and faint enough that someone else might have missed them. She didn't. She raised her hand and, without touching, drew a small circle in the air to keep the words from dissolving too quickly. Morning returned the spa to cheerful normalcy. Light strengthened. Voices resumed their kind echoes. The panes were clear and ordinary. A world reduced to reflections and view. If she leaned close, she could see where the glass, warmed and cooled, kept a memory at certain angles, impressions that weren't there until they were, the way a thought appears in a mind that is ready. Amma waved her in, pressing a packet of tea into her hand. For home, she said. Eucalyptus. Back on land, when her bathroom mirror fogged, she looked for circles and arrows and found, only sometimes, the faintest suggestion of a word that could have been a trick of light. She stepped carefully anyway, counted 4 before opening doors, hung her robe where the breeze couldn't boss it. When she closed her eyes at night, the waterwall's song would return, and the ship's quiet habit of writing kindness on glass would make the dark feel like a room with a lamp left on. Small, warm, and immeasurably helpful. Story number 10. On the last night before land, the ship settled into that special quiet that feels earned. Suitcases waited by doors. Hallway flowers wore a last-day grace. Somewhere far below, luggage belts turned with a patient rubber sigh that sounded like rain remembered. He couldn't sleep. The sea was kind. His mind was busy. He went out to listen to the wake. The promenade lay empty and polished. The air had that late-hour cleanness, eucalyptus from the spa still faint in the vents, linen and lemon and salt. Overhead, a speaker gave the soft 2-note chime the ship used for announcements. And then, a third tone, lower, friendly, like a hand on a shoulder. No words followed. The quiet after it felt purposeful, like the space a teacher leaves before a roll call. He walked under the lifeboats, past the familiar numbers. 12. A shade of shadow. 14. The gap between had never looked so calm. The sea wore ink. In the dark glass, his reflection looked like a person from a postcard caught thinking. The wake lifted like silk torn very slowly. In its hiss, he heard an almost word, not quite language, more rhythm than message. Present, it nearly said. And then again, present. He passed the theater doors. One stood open a sliver. Within, a small planet of gold lay on the stage, the ghost light, patient and unassuming, as if to say, "We haven't forgotten you." He lowered his head to it without meaning to, the way one nods to a chapel lamp, and moved on. Near the forward lounge, an elevator arrived empty. Its chime slipped into 3 notes, the middle wandering half a breath before finding itself, the way a candle's flame wavers and strengthens. He stepped in and watched the panel. The numbers rose, paused at a dash, and then only in the reflection, not on the glass, offered a letter that belonged to no deck he knew. The car waited. He didn't ask anything of it. He touched 12. The doors closed, like a promise kept. The corridor smelled of new carpet and night air. At the bend, a laminated note at knee height, small as a good idea, read, "Corridor adjustments may occur overnight." He smiled. He'd learned the ship's little alphabets, the brighter triangles in the woven pattern that meant keep them to your left, the warmer light that meant you were on the odds, the cool splashes that meant the evens. The hull was straight tonight, as if the ship had smoothed its sheets for company. A paper arrow on a service cart pointed him toward the open deck. He followed it, not because he needed the hint, but because it felt good to obey a polite suggestion. He reached the rail. Back there, the ship's trail feathered out to the dark like chalk on slate. Ahead, nothing, which is the ocean's way of being generous. Another chime drifted on the air that might have been a bell far out or the memory of one. He thought of all the small things that had not happened this voyage, the tiny disasters that had been made into neat curiosities by careful hands. A ring not lost to a drain, a glass steadied before it rolled, a door waited on a count of 4. The ship had felt like a host with 1,000 eyes, none of them unkind. He turned to go and noticed a shape on a deck chair tucked in the shadow near the bulkhead. A small tin box. The sort mints come in, its paint chipped to a charming degree. It would have fallen eventually if the ship breathed a little harder. He lifted it, and it made a light, competent sound, something inside shifting with a papery patience. Lost things look lonely. This didn't. It looked like something waiting to be delivered. He carried it to the photo gallery because the gallery, he had learned, was where the ship displayed what it fixed. The rails were empty at that hour, wiped clean for a new voyage. A night attendant he hadn't met sat with her ledger and a sweater around her shoulders. He put the tin on the counter and said softly, "This was almost a noise." She smiled the smile of people who work the gentle shift and speak softly out of respect for sleeping steel. "We'll find its person," she said, and shook the box lightly. "There's a note in there." She didn't open it. Some things ask for daylight. She slid it into a drawer and wrote a neat line. The printer behind her hummed once, as if clearing its throat, and then behaved. In the spa corridor on his way past, the glass wore a blush of fog that printed 2 words when he breathed on it without touching. "Good night." He laughed under his breath at being told to go to bed by a door. The atrium slept. The great brass clock, steady as a keel, held midnight like a cup. The chandelier did not move no sigh of glass tonight. No crystal practicing its note. A cleaning cart ghosted by. The night baker's ovens made the air taste faintly of bread that would be someone's morning. On a small table by a planter, a cream square of card waited, as if it had stepped out of turndown by accident. He checked himself. He had promised not to collect the ship's kindness as if it were his. He read it in place. "If you hear a cart, give it 10 seconds. He smiled. Old council, evergreen. Back in the corridor, he noticed a slight gold at the edge of a photograph frame, one of those ship images hung to make hallways less like pipes. He straightened it with a fingertip. It settled into level with a satisfaction almost audible. He walked on light. At his door, the handle was cooler than it had been an hour before. Inside, his suitcase waited with its tag like a bookmark. A paper had been slipped beneath, not the usual schedule, but a small receipt with a description line he hadn't earned. Print, unclaimed, sunrise, 0. Someone had tucked it there for him, or for the idea of him. He didn't have the print. He had the thought of it. It felt enough. Sleep came the way it does after a ship tells you she is watching. He dreamt a list without names, only the words all present said twice, once for good measure. The hull hummed. The engine's even prayer kept time the way a heart keeps time for a body that mostly doesn't notice. Morning lifted over water like a patient curtain. He woke to the harbor arranging itself. Cranes tall and careful, tugs like buttons, gulls considering. The announcements had their rightful brightness. People stood with luggage and stories, and the tenderness that comes after you've been taken care of, and want to say thank you to the room itself. He found the tin box at guest services because the gallery had sent it there. The crew member opened it for the person who'd mislaid it. A woman with a scarf the color of a horizon. Inside lay a folded scrap of paper, a tiny seashell, and a short line in tidy script. "Thank you for the light." The woman touched the shell to her lips and smiled the complicated smile of someone who understands when a small thing stands in for a large one. She looked at him, as if the thanks had a way of reproducing itself. On the gangway he turned, because who doesn't, and looked back at the ship. Lights winked evenly along her decks. Somewhere within, a lamp waited to be spiked on its mark. A corridor straightened itself. A printer saved a sequence for a night no one would see, A glass decided what to say in steam. The missing numbers missed politely. The extra hour slept, having done its good work nights earlier. The wake wrote its signature on the morning. He lifted a hand not to wave but to promise to remember, which is a different gesture. On land later, when a hallway felt too long, he would keep the brighter triangles on his left. When a phone chimed once in a lower tone for no good reason, he would answer out loud, "Present," and laugh at himself and mean it. Some nights he would leave a small lamp lit in a quiet room, just in case a stage needed not to be empty. And in dreams, if a list arrived, he hoped it would end as it had on the ship, with nothing left to correct and a voice metal and warm and particular saying, in a tone he trusted, "Good night."